Chapter 49 of Mary Marston. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mary Marston by George MacDonald. Chapter 49. Thornwick. It was almost with bewilderment that Mrs. Helmer revisited Thornwick. The near past seemed to have vanished like a dream that leaves a sorrow behind it, and the far past to take its place. She had never been accustomed to reflect on her own feelings. Things came, were welcome or unwelcome, proved better or worse than she had anticipated, passed away, and were mostly forgotten. With plenty of faculty, Letty had not yet emerged from the chrysalid condition. She lived much as one in a dream, with whose dream mingle sounds and glimmers from the waking world. Very few of us are awake, very few even alive in true availing sense. Pooh, what stuff, says the sleeper, and will say it until the waking begins to come. On the threshold of her old home, then, Letty found her old self awaiting her. She crossed it, and was once more just Letty. A Letty wrapped in the garments of sorrow and with a heaviness at the heart, but far from such a miserable Letty as during the last of her former life there. Little joy had been hers since the terrible night when she fled from its closed doors. And now that she returned, she could take up everything where she had left it, except the gladness. But peace is better than gladness, and she was on the way to find that. Mrs. Wardour, who, for all her severity, was not without a good-sized heart, and whose conscience had spoken to her in regard of Letty far oftener than any torture would have made her allow, was touched with compassion at sight of her worn and sad look, and granting to herself that the poor thing had been punished enough, even for her want of respect to the house of Thornwick, broke down a little, though with well-preserved dignity, and took the wandering ewe lamb to her bosom. Letty, loving and forgiving always, nestled in it for a moment, and in her own room quietly wept a long time. When she came out, Mrs. Wardour pleased herself with a fancy that her eyes were red with the tears of repentance. But Letty never dreamed of repenting, for that would have been to deny Tom, to cut off her married life, throw it from her, and never more see Tom. By degrees, rapid yet easy, she slid into all her old ways, took again the charge of the dairy as if she had never left it, attended to the linen, darned the stockings, and in everything but her pale, thin face and heavy, exhausted heart was the young Letty again. She even went to the harness room to look to Cousin Godfrey's stirrups and bits, but finding morning after morning for a whole week that they had not once been neglected, dismissed the care not without satisfaction. Mrs. Wardour continued kind to her, but every now and then would allow a tone as of remembered naughtiness to be subaudible in speech or request. Letty, even in her own heart, never resented it. She had been so used to it in the old days that it seemed only natural, and then her aunt considered her health in the kindest way. Now that Letty had known some of the troubles of marriage, she felt more sympathy with her, and did not look down upon her from quite such a height, and to Letty this was strangely delightful. Oh, what a dry, hard, cold world this would grow to but for the blessing of its many sicknesses. When Godfrey saw her moving about the house as in former days, but changed like one of the ghosts of his saddest dreams, a new love began to rise out of the buried seed of the old. In vain he reasoned with himself. In vain he resisted. The image of Letty, with its trusting eyes fixed on him so solemn sad, and its watching looks full of ministration, haunted him, and was too much for him. She was never the sort of woman he could have fancied himself falling in love with. He did, in fact, say to himself that she was only almost a lady, but at the word his heart rebuked him for a traitor to love and its holy laws. Neither in person was she at all his ideal. A woman like Hesper, uplifted and strong, broad-fronted and fearless, large-limbed and full of latent life, was more of the ideal he could have written poetry about. But we're deeper than we know. Who is capable of knowing his own ideal? The ideal of man's self is hid in the bosom of God, and may lie ages away from his knowledge, and his ideal of woman is the ideal belonging to this unknown self. The ideal only can bring forth an ideal. He cannot therefore know his own ideal of woman. It is nevertheless, so I presume, that his own unknown ideal that makes a man choose against his choice. Gladly would Godfrey now have taken Letty to his arms. It was no longer anything that from boyhood he had vowed rather to die unmarried and let the land go to a stranger than marry a widow. He had to recall every restraining fact of his and her position to prevent him from now precipitating that which he had before too long delayed. But the gulf of the grave and the jealousy of a mother were between them. For if he were again to rouse her suspicions, she would certainly get rid of Letty as she had before intended, so depriving her of a home and him of opportunity. He kept therefore out of Letty's way as much as he could, went more about the farm, and took long rides. Nothing was further from Letty than any merest suspicion of the sort of regard that Godfrey cherished for her. There was in her nothing of the self-sentimental. Her poet was gone from her, but she did not therefore take to poetry. Nay, what poetry she had learned to like was no longer anything to her, now her singing-bird had flown to the land of song. To her Tom was the greatest, the one poet of the age. He had been hers, was hers still. For did he not die telling her that he would go on watching till she came to him? He had loved her, she knew. He had learned to love her better before he died. She must be patient. The day would come when she should be a Psyche, as he had told her, and soar aloft in search of her mate. The sense of wifehood had grown one with her consciousness. It mingled with all her prayers, both in chamber and in church. As she went about the house, she was dreaming of her Tom. An angel in heaven, she said to herself, but none the less her husband, and waiting for her. If she did not read poetry, she read her New Testament, and if she understood it only in a childish fashion, she obeyed it in a childlike one. Whence the way of all wisdom lay open before her. It is not where one is, but in what direction he is going. Before her, too, was her little boy, born in his father's arms. She pictured him, and hearing from him of the mother who was coming to them by and by, when God had made her good enough to rejoin them. But while she continued thus simple, Godfrey could not fail to see how much more of a woman she had grown. He was not yet capable of seeing that she could never have got so far with him, even if he had married her. Love and marriage are of the Father's most powerful means for the making of his foolish little ones into sons and daughters. But so unlike in many cases are the immediate consequences to those desired and expected, that it is hard for not a few to believe that he is anywhere looking after their fate, caring about them at all, and the doubt would be a reasonable one. If the end of things was marriage, but the end is life, that we become the children of God, after which all things can and will go their grand natural course. The heart of the Father will be content for his children, and the hearts of the children will be content in their Father. Godfrey indulged one great and serious mistake in reference to Letty, namely, that having learned the character of Tom through the saddest of personal experience, she must have come to think of him as he did, and must have dismissed from her heart every remnant of love for him. Of course he would not hint at such a thing, he said to himself, nor would she for a moment allow it, but nothing else could be the state of her mind. He did not know that in a woman's love there is more of the specially divine element than in a man's, namely the original, the unmediated, the first of God's love, is not founded upon any merit, rests only on being and need, and the worth that is yet unborn. The Redmaynes were again at Durnmelling, and had been for some weeks, and Sepia had taken care that she and Godfrey should meet on the footpath to Testbridge, in the field accessible by the breach in the here and there, and anywhere suitable for a little detention and talk that should seem accidental and be out of sight. Nor was Godfrey the man to be insensible to the influence of such a woman. Brought to bear at close quarters, a man less vulnerable, I hate the word, but it is the right one with Sepia concerned, for she was in truth an enemy, might perhaps have yielded room to the suspicion that these meetings were not all so accidental as they appeared. And as Sepia treated them, but no glimmer of such a thought passed through the mind of Godfrey, he knew nothing of all that my readers know to Sepia's disadvantage, and her eyes were enough to subdue most men from the first, for a time at least. Had it not been for the return of Letty, she would by this time have had him her slave. Nothing but slavery could it ever be to love a woman like her, who gave no love in return, only exercised power. But although he was always glad to meet her, and his heart had begun to beat a little faster at sight of her approach, the glamour of her presence was nearly destroyed by the arrival of Letty, and Sepia was more than sharp enough to perceive a difference in the expression of his eyes the next time she met him. At the very first glance she suspected some hostile influence at work, intentionally hostile, for persons with a consciousness like Sepia's are always imagining enemies, and as the two worst enemies she could have were the truth and a woman, she was alternately jealous and terrified. The truth and a woman together she had not yet begun to fear. That would indeed be too much. She soon found there was a young woman at Thornwick who had but just arrived, and ere long she learned who she was. One indeed who had already a shadowy existence in her life. Was it possible the shadow should be now taking solidarity and threatening to foil her? Not once did it occur to her that were it so there would be retribution in it. She had heard of Tom's death through the Firefly, which had a kind, extravagant article about him, but she had not once thought of his widow. And there she was, a hedge across the path she wanted to go. If the house of Durnmelling had been but one story higher, that she might see all round Thornwick. For some time now, as I have already more than hinted, Sepia had been fashioning a man to her thrall, Mewks, namely, the body servant of Mr. Redmayne. It was a very gradual process she had adopted, and it had been the more successful. It had got so far with him that whatever Sepia showed the least wish to understand, Mewks would take endless trouble to learn for her. The rest of the servants, both at Durnmelling and in London, were none of them very friendly with her, least of all Jemima, who was now with her mistress as lady's maid, the accomplished attendant whom Hesper had procured in place of Mary being away for a holiday. The more Sepia realized, or thought she realized, the position she was in, the more desirous was she to get out of it, and the only feasible and safe way in her eyes was marriage. There was nothing between that and a return to what she counted slavery. Rather than lift again such a hideous load of irksomeness, she would find her way out of a world in which it was not possible, she said, to be both good and comfortable. She had in truth tried only the latter, but if she could, she thought, secure for a husband this gentleman yeoman, she might hold up her head with the best. Even if Gallofa should reappear, she would know then how to meet him with a friend or two, such as she had never had yet. She could do what she pleased. It was hard work to get on quite alone, or with people who cared only for themselves. She must have some love on her side, someone who cared for her. From all she could learn, there was nothing that amounted even to ordinary friendship between Mr. Wardour and the young widow. She was in the family, but as a distant, poor relation. Much as I am myself, thought Sepia, with a bitter laugh that even in her own eyes she should be comparable to a poor creature like Letty. The fact, however, remained that Godfrey was a little altered toward her. She must have been telling him something against her, something she had heard from that detestable little hypocrite who was turned away on suspicion of theft. Yes, that was how Sepia talked to herself about Mary. One morning Letty, finding she had an hour's leisure, for her aunt did not pursue her as of old time, wandered out to the oak on the edge of the ha so memorable with the shadowy presence of her Tom. She had not been seated under it many minutes before Godfrey caught sight of her from his horse's back. Knowing his mother was gone to Testbridge, he yielded to an urgent longing, took his horse to the stable, and crossed the grass to where she sat. Letty was thinking of Tom. What else was there of her own to do? Thinking like a child, looking up into the cloud-flecked sky, and thinking Tom was somewhere there. Though she could not see him, she must be good and patient, that she might go up to him as he could not come down to her. If he could, he would have come long ago. All the enchantment of the first days of her love had come back upon the young widow. All the ill that had crept in between had failed from out her memory, as the false notes in music melt in the air that carries the true ones across ravine and river, meadow and grove, to the listening ear. Letty lived in a dream of her husband in heaven, yet not from her. Such a dream of bliss and hope as in itself went far to make up for all her sorrows. She was sitting with her back toward the tree and her face to Thornwick, and yet she did not see Godfrey till he was within a few yards of her. She smiled, expecting his kind greeting, but was startled to hear from behind her, instead, the voice of a lady greeting him. She turned her head involuntarily, and there was the head of Sepia rising above the breach in the ha, and Godfrey had turned aside and run to give her his hand. Now Letty knew Sepia by sight, from the evening she had spent at the old hall. More of her she knew nothing. From the mind of Tom in his illness, her baleful influence had vanished like an evil dream, and Mary had not thought it necessary to let him know how falsely, contemptuously, and contemptibly she had behaved toward him. Letty, therefore, had no feeling toward Sepia but one of admiration for her grace and beauty, which she could appreciate the more that they were so different from her own. "Thank you," said Sepia, holding fast by Godfrey's hand, and coming up with a little pant. "What a lovely day it is for your haymaking! How can you afford the time to play knight-errant to a distressed damsel?" "The hay is nearly independent of my presence," replied Godfrey. "Sun and wind have done their parts too well for my being of much use. Take me with you to see how they are getting on. I am as fond of hay as Bottom in his translation." She had learned Godfrey's love of literature, and knew that one quotation may stand for much knowledge. "I will with pleasure," said Godfrey, perhaps a little consoled in the midst of his disappointment, and they walked away, neither taking notice of Letty. "I did not know," she said to herself, "that the two houses had come together at last. What a handsome couple they make!" What passed between them is scarcely worthy of record. It is enough to say that Sepia found her companion distrait, and he felt her a little invasive. In a short while they came back together, and Sepia saw Letty under the great bough of the Durnmelling oak. Godfrey handed her down the rent, careful himself not to invade Durnmelling with a single foot. She ran home and up to a certain window with her opera glass, but the branches and foliage of the huge oak would have concealed pairs and pairs of lovers. Godfrey turned toward Letty. She had not stirred. "What a beautiful creature Miss Yolland is," she said, looking up with a smile of welcome and a calmness that prevented the slightest suspicion of a flattering jealousy. "I was coming to you," returned Godfrey. "I never saw her till her head came up over the ha. Yes, she is beautiful. At least she has good eyes." "They are splendid. What a wife she would make for you, Cousin Godfrey." "I should like to see such a two." Letty was beyond the faintest suggestion of coquetry. Her words drove a sting to the heart of Godfrey. He turned pale. But not a word would he have spoken then, had not Letty in her innocence gone on to torture him. She sprang from the ground. "Are you ill, Cousin Godfrey?" she cried in alarm, and with that sweet tremor of the voice that shows the heart is near. "You are quite white. Oh dear, I've said something I oughtn't to have said. What can it be? Do forgive me, Cousin Godfrey." In her childlike anxiety she would have thrown her arms around his neck, but her hands only reached his shoulders. He drew back. Such was the nature of the man that every sting tasted of offense. But he mastered himself, and in his turn, alarmed at the idea of having possibly hurt her, caught her hands in his. As they stood regarding each other with troubled eyes, the embankment of his prudence gave way, and the stored passion broke out. "You don't mean you would like to see me married, Letty?" he groaned. "Yes, indeed I do, Cousin Godfrey. You would make such a lovely husband." "Ah, I thought as much. I knew you never cared for me, Letty." He dropped her hands and turned half aside, like a figure warped with fire. "I care for you more than anybody in the world, except perhaps Mary," said Letty. Truthfulness was a part of her. "And I care for you more than all the world, more than very being. It is worthless without you, oh Letty. Your eyes haunt me night and day. I love you with my whole soul." "How kind of you, Cousin Godfrey," faltered Letty, trembling, and not knowing what she said. She was very frightened, but hardly knew why, for the idea of Godfrey in love with her was all but inconceivable. Nevertheless, its approach was terrible. Like a fascinated bird, she could not take her eyes off his face. Her knees began to fail her. It was all she could do to stand, but Godfrey was full of himself, and had not the most shadowy suspicion of how she felt. He took her emotion for a favorable sign, and stupidly went on. "Letty, I can't help it. I know I oughtn't to speak to you like this so soon, but I can't keep quiet any longer. I love you more than the universe and its maker. 1,000 times rather would I cease to live than live without you to love me. I have loved you for years and years, longer than I know. I was loving you with heart and soul and brain and eyes when you went away and left me." "Cousin Godfrey," shrieked Letty, "don't you know I belong to Tom?" And she dropped like one lifeless on the grass at his feet. Godfrey felt as if suddenly damned, and his hell was death. He stood gazing on the white face. The world, heaven, God, and nature were dead, and that was the soul of it all, dead before him. But such death is never born of love. This agony was but the fog of disappointed self-love, and out of it suddenly rose what seemed a new power to live, but one from a lower world. It was all a wretched dream, out of which he was no more to issue, in which he must go on for ever, dreaming, yet acting as one wide awake. Mechanically he stooped and lifted the death-defying lover in his arms, and carried her to the house. He felt no thrill as he held the treasure to his heart. It was the merest material contact. He bore her to the room where his mother sat, laid her on the sofa, said he had found her under the oak tree, and went to his study away in the roof. On a chair in the middle of the floor he sat, like a man bereft of all. Nothing came between him and suicide but infinite scorn. A slow rage devoured his heart. Here he was, a man who knew his own worth, his faithfulness, his unchangeableness, cast over the wall of the universe into the waste places among the broken shards of ruin. If there was a God, and the rage in his heart declared his being, why did he make him? To make him for such a misery was pure injustice, was wilful cruelty. Henceforth he would live above what God or woman could do to him. He rose and went to the hayfield, whence he did not return till after midnight. He did not sleep, but he came to a resolution. In the morning he told his mother that he wanted a change. Now that the hay was safe, he would have a run, he hardly knew where, possibly on the continent. She must not be uneasy if she didn't hear from him for a week or two. Perhaps he would have a look at the pyramids. The old lady was filled with dismay, but scarcely had she begun to expostulate when she saw in his eyes that something was seriously amiss, and held her peace. She had had to learn that with both father and son. Godfrey went and courted distraction 10 years before. He would have brooded. That he would not do now. The thing was not worth it. His pride was strong as ever, and both helped him to get over his suffering, and prevented him from gaining the good of it. He entrenched himself in his pride. No one should say he had not had his will. He was a strong man, and was going to prove it to himself afresh. Thus thought Godfrey. But he is in reality a weak man, who must have recourse to pride to carry him through. Only if a man has not love enough to make a hero of him, what is he to do? He was away a month, and came back in seeming health and spirits, but it was no small relief to him to find, on his arrival, that Letty was no longer at Thornwick. She had gone through a sore time. To have made Godfrey unhappy made her miserable, but how was she to help it? She belonged to Tom. Not once did she entertain the thought of ceasing to be Tom's. She did not even say to herself, what would Tom do if she forgot and forsook him? And for what he could not help, for having left her because death took him away. But what was she to do? She must not remain where she was, no more must she tell his mother why she went. She wrote to Mary and told her she could not stay much longer. They were very kind, she said, but she must be gone before Godfrey came back. Mary suspected the truth. The fact that Letty did not give her any reason was almost enough. The supposition also rendered intelligible the strange mixture of misery and hardness in Godfrey's behavior at the time of Letty's old mishap. She answered, begging her to keep her mind easy about the future, and her friend informed of whatever concerned her. This much from Mary was enough to set Letty at comparative ease. She began to recover strength, and was able to write a letter to Godfrey to leave where he would find it in his study. It was a lovely letter, the utterance of a simple childlike spirit, with much in it too, I confess, that was but prettily childish. She poured out on Godfrey the affection of a woman-child. She told him what a reverence and love he had been to her always, told him too that it would change her love into fear, perhaps something worse, if he tried to make her forget Tom. She told him he was much too grand for her to dare love him in that way, but she could look up to him like an angel, only he must not come between her and Tom. Nothing could be plainer, simpler, honester, or stronger than the way the little woman wrote her mind to the great man. Had he been worthy of her, he might even yet, with her help, have got above his passion in a grand way, and been a great man indeed. But as so many do, he only sat upon himself, kept himself down, and sank far below his passion. When he went to his study the day after his return, he saw the letter. His heart leaped like a wild thing in a trap at sight of the ill-shaped, childish writing. But will my lady reader believe it? The first thought that shot through it was, she shall find it too late. I am not one to be left and taken at will. When he read it, however, it was with a curling lip of scorn at the childishness of the creature to whom he had offered the heart of Godfrey Wardour. Instead of admiring the lovely devotion of the girl widow to her boy husband, he scorned himself for having dreamed of a creature who could not only love a fool like Tom Helmer, but go on loving him after he was dead, and that even when Godfrey Wardour had condescended to let her know that he loved her. It was thus the devil befooled him. Perhaps the worst devil a man can be possessed withal is himself. In mere madness the man is beside himself, but in this case he is inside himself. The presiding, indwelling, inspiring spirit of him is himself, and that is the hardest of all to cast out. Godfrey rose from the reading of that letter, cured, as he called it, but it was a cure that left the wound open as a door to the entrance of evil things. He tore the letter into 1,000 pieces and threw them into an empty grate, not even showed it the respect of burning it with fire. Mary had got her affairs settled, and was again in the old place, the hallowed temple of so many holy memories. I do not forget it was a shop I call a temple. In that shop God had been worshipped with holiest worship. that is, obedience, and would be again. Neither do I forget that the devil had been worshipped there too. In what temple is he not? He has fallen like lightning from heaven, but has not yet been cast out of the earth. In that shop, however, he would be worshipped no more for a season. At once she wrote to Letty, saying the room which had been hers was at her service. As soon as she pleased to occupy it, she would take her father's. Letty breathed a deep sigh of redemption, and made haste to accept the offer, but to let Mrs. Wardour know her resolve was a severe strain on her courage. I will not give the conversation that followed her announcement that she was going to visit Mary Marston. Her aunt met it with scorn and indignation. Ingratitude, laziness, love of low company, all the old words of offense she threw afresh in her face. But Letty could not help being pleased to find that her aunt's storm no longer swamped her boat. When she began, however, to abuse Mary, calling her a low creature who actually gave up an independent position to put herself at the beck and call of a fine lady, Letty grew angry. "I must not sit and hear you call Mary names, aunt," she said. "When you cast me out, she stood by me. You do not understand her. She is the only friend I ever had except Tom." "You dare, you thankless hussy, to say such a thing in the house where you've been clothed and fed and sheltered for so many years? You're the child of your father with a vengeance. Get out of my sight." "Aunt," said Letty, rising. "No aunt of yours," interrupted the wrathful woman. "Mrs. Wardour," said Letty with dignity, "you have been my benefactor, but hardly my friend. Mary has taught me the difference. I owe you more than you will ever give me the chance of repaying you. But what friendship could have stood for an hour the hard words you have been in the way of giving me, as far back as I can remember? Hard words take all the sweetness from shelter. Mary is the only Christian I have ever known." "So we are all pagans except your low-lived lady's maid. Upon my word, she makes me feel often," said Letty, bursting into tears, "as if I were with Jesus himself, as if he must be in the room somewhere." So saying, she left her and went to put up her things. Mrs. Wardour locked the door of the room where she sat, and refused to see or speak to her again. Letty went away and walked to Testbridge. "Godfrey will do something to make her understand," she said to herself, weeping as she walked. Whether Godfrey ever did, I cannot tell. End of chapter 49. Thornwick.
Chapter 50 of Mary Marston. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by INT Josh. Mary Marston by George MacDonald. Chapter 50. William and Mary Marston. The same day on which Turnbull opened his new shop, a man was seen on a ladder painting out the sign above the old one, but the paint took time to dry. The same day, also, Mary returned to Testbridge, and going in by the kitchen door, went up to her father's room, of which and of her own she had kept the keys, to the indignation of Turnbull, who declared he did not know how to get on without them for storage. But for all his bluster, he was afraid of Mary, and did not dare touch anything she had left. That night she spent alone in the house, but she could not sleep. She got up and went down to the shop. It was a bright moonlit night, and all the house, even where the moon could not enter, was full of glimmer and gleam, except the shop. There she lighted a candle, sat down on a pile of goods, and gave herself up to memories of the past. Back and back went her thoughts, as far as she could send them. God was everywhere in all the story, and the clearer she saw him there, the surer she was that she would find him as she went on. She was neither sad nor fearful. The dead hours of the night came, that valley of the shadow of death where faith seems to grow weary in sleep, and all the things of the shadow wake up and come out and say, "Here we are, and there's nothing but us and our kind in the universe." They woke up and came out upon Mary now, but she fought them off. Either there is mighty triumphant life at the root and apex of all things, or life is not. And whence, then, the power of dreaming horrors? It is life alone, life imperfect, that can fear. Death cannot fear. Even the terror that walketh by night is a proof that I live, and that it shall not prevail against me. And to Mary, besides her heavenly Father, her William Marston seemed near all the time. Wherever she turned she saw the signs of him, and she pleased herself to think that perhaps he was there to welcome her. But it would not have made her the least sad to know for certain that he was far off, and would never come near her again in this world. She knew that, despite of time and space, she was and must be near him so long as she loved and did the truth. She knew there is no bond so strong, none so close, none so lasting as the truth. In God alone, who is the truth, can creatures meet. The place was left in sad confusion and dirt, and she did not a little that night, to restore order at least. But at length she was tired, and went up to her room. On the first landing there was a window to the street. She stopped and looked out, candle in hand, but drew back with a start. On the opposite side of the way stood a man, looking up, she thought, at the house. She hastened to her room and to bed. If God was not watching, no waking was of use. And if God was watching, she might sleep in peace. She did sleep, and woke refreshed. Her first care in the morning was to write to Letty, with the result I have set down. The next thing she did was to go and ask Beanie to give her some breakfast. The old woman was delighted to see her, and ready to lock her door at once and go back to her old quarters. They returned together, while Testbridge was yet but half awake. Many things had to be done before the shop could be opened. Beanie went after charwoman, and soon a great bustle of cleaning arose. But the door was kept shut, and the front windows. In the afternoon Letty came fresh from misery into more than counterbalancing joy. She took time but to put off her bonnet and shawl, and was presently at work helping Mary, cheerful as hope and a good conscience could make her. Mary was in no hurry to open the shop. There was stock to be taken. Many things had to be rearranged, and not a few things to be added before she could begin with comfort, and she must see to it all herself, for she was determined to engage no assistant until she could give her orders without hesitation. She was soon satisfied that she could not do better than make a proposal to Letty, which she had for some time contemplated, namely, that she should take up her permanent abode with her, and help her in the shop. Letty was charmed, nor ever thought of the annoyance it would be to her aunt. Mary had thought of that, but saw that for Letty to allow the prejudices of her aunt to influence her would be to order her life not by the law of that God whose son was a workingman, but after the whim and folly of an ill-educated old woman. A new spring of life seemed to bubble up in Letty the moment Mary mentioned the matter, and in serving she soon proved herself one after Mary's own heart. Letty's day was henceforth without a care, and her rest was sweet to her. Many customers were even more pleased with her than with Mary. Before long, Mary, besides her salary, gave her a small share in the business. Mrs. Wardour carried her custom to the Turnbulls. When the paint was dry, which obliterated the old sign, people saw the new one begin with an M, and the sign-writer went on until there stood in full, Mary Marston. Mr. Brett hinted he would rather have seen it without the Christian name, but Mary insisted she would do and be nothing she would not hold just that name to. And on the sign her own name, neither more nor less, should stand. She would have liked, she said, to make it William and Mary Marston, for the business was to go on exactly as her father had taught her. The spirit of her father should never be out of the place, and if she failed, of which she had no fear, She would fail trying to carry out his ideas, but people were too dull to understand, and she therefore set the sign so in her heart only. Her old friends soon began to come about her again, and it was not many weeks before she saw fit to go to London to add to her stock. The evening of her return, as she and Letty sat over a late tea, a silence fell, during which Letty had a brooding fit. "I wonder how Cousin Godfrey is getting on," she said at last, and smiled sadly. "How do you mean, getting on?" asked Mary. "I was wondering whether Miss Yolland and he—" Mary started from her seat, white as the tablecloth. "Letty," she said in a voice of utter dismay, "you don't mean that woman is making friends with him?" "I saw them together more than once, and they seemed, well, on very good terms." "Then it is all over with him!" cried Mary in despair. "Oh, Letty, what is to be done? Why didn't you tell me before? He'll be madly in love with her by this time. They always are." "But where's the harm, Mary? She's a very handsome lady, and of a good family." "We're all of good enough family," said Mary a little petulantly. "But Miss Yolland, Letty, that Miss Yolland, she's a bad woman, Letty." "I never heard you say such a hard word of anybody before, Mary. It frightens me to hear you." "It's a true word of her, Letty." "How can you be so sure?" Mary was silent. There was that about Letty that made the maiden shrink from telling the married woman what she knew. Besides, in so far as Tom had been concerned, she could not bring herself, even without mentioning his name, to talk of him to his wife. There was no evil to be prevented, and no good to be done by it. If Letty was ever to know those passages in his life, she must hear them first in high places, and from the lips of the repentant man himself. "I cannot tell you, Letty," she said. "You know the two bonds of friendship are the right of silence and the duty of speech. I dare say you have some things which, truly as I know you love me, you neither wish nor feel at liberty to tell me." Letty thought of what had so lately passed between her and her cousin Godfrey, and felt almost guilty. She never thought of one of the many things Tom had done or said that had cut her to the heart. Those had no longer any existence. They were swallowed in the gulf of forgetful love, dismissed even as God casts the sins of his children behind his back. Behind God's back is just nowhere. She did not answer, and again there was silence for a time, during which Mary kept walking about the room, her hands clasped behind her, the fingers interlaced, and twisted with a strain almost fierce. "There's no time, there's no time," she cried at length. "How are we to find out? And if we knew all about it, what could we do? Oh, Letty, what am I to do?" "Anyhow, Mary dear, you can't be to blame. One would think you fancied yourself accountable for Cousin Godfrey." "I am accountable for him. He has done more for me than any man but my father, and I know what he does not know, and what the ignorance of will be his ruin. I know that one of the best men in the world," so in her agony she called him, "is in danger of being married by one of the worst women, and I can't bear it. I can't bear it." "Well, what can you do, Mary?" "That's what I want to know," returned Mary with irritation. "What am I to do? What am I to do?" "If he's in love with her, he wouldn't believe a word anyone, even you, told him against her." "That is true, I suppose, but it won't clear me. I must do something." She threw herself on the couch with a groan. "It's horrid!" she cried, and buried her face in the pillow. All this time Letty had been so bewildered by Mary's agitation, and the cause of it was to her so vague, that apprehension for her cousin did not wake. But when Mary was silent, then came the thought that if she had not so repulsed him, but she could not help it, and would not think in that direction. Mary started from the couch, and began again to pace the room, wringing her hands and walking up and down like a wild beast in its cage. It was so unlike her to be thus seriously discomposed that Letty began to be frightened. She sat silent and looked at her, then spoke the spirit of truth in the scholar, for the teacher was too troubled to hear. She rose, and going up to Mary from behind, put her arm around her, and whispered in her ear, "Mary, why don't you ask Jesus?" Mary stopped short, and looked at Letty. She was not thinking about her. She was questioning herself why she had not done as Letty said. Something was wrong with her, that was clear, if nothing else was. She threw herself again on the couch, and Letty saw her body heaving with her sobs. Then Letty was more frightened, and feared she had done wrong. Was it her part to remind Mary of what she knew so much better than she? But then I was only referring her to herself, she thought. A few minutes, and Mary rose. Her face was wet and white, but perplexity had vanished from it, and resolution had taken its place. She threw her arms around Letty and kissed her and held her face against hers. Letty had never seen in her such an expression of emotion and tenderness. "I have found out, Letty, dear," she said. Thank you, Letty. You are a true sister." "What have you found out, Mary?" "I have found out why I did not go at once to ask him what I ought to do. It was just because I was afraid of what he would tell me to do." And with that the tears ran down her cheeks afresh. "Then you know now what to do?" asked Letty. "Yes," answered Mary, and sat down. End of chapter 50. William and Mary Marston.
Chapter 51 of Mary Marston. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mary Marston by George MacDonald. Chapter 51. A Hard Task. The next morning, leaving the shop to Letty, Mary set out immediately after breakfast to go to Thornwick. But the duty she had there to perform was so distasteful that she felt her very limbs refuse the office required of them. They trembled so under her that she could scarcely walk. She sent, therefore, to the neighboring inn for a fly. All the way as she went, she was hoping she might be spared an encounter with Mrs. Wardour. But the old lady heard the fly, saw her get out, and imagining she had brought Letty back in some fresh trouble, hastened to prevent either of them from entering the house. The door stood open, and they met on the broad step. "Good morning, Mrs. Wardour," said Mary, trying to speak without betraying emotion. "Good morning, Miss Marston," returned Mrs. Wardour grimly. "Is Mr. Wardour at home?" asked Mary. "What is your business with him?" rejoined the mother. "Yes, it is with him," returned Mary, as if she had mistaken her question, and there had been a point of exclamation after the what. "About that hussy? I do not know whom you call by the name," replied Mary, who would have been glad indeed to find a fellow protector of Godfrey in his mother. "You know well enough whom I mean. Whom should it be but Letty, love?" "My business has nothing to do with her," answered Mary. "Whom has it to do with, then?" "With Mr. Wardour." "What is it?" "Only Mr. Wardour himself must hear it. It is his business, not mine. I will have nothing to do with it." "I have no desire to give you the least trouble about it," rejoined Mary. "You can't see Mr. Wardour. He's not one to be at the beck and call of every silly woman that wants him." "Then I will write and tell him I called, but you would not allow me to see him." "I will give him a message if you like." "Then tell him what I have just said. I am going home to write to him. Good morning." She was getting into the fly again when Mrs. Wardour, reflecting that it must be something of consequence that brought her there so early in a fly, and made her show such a determined front to so great a personage as herself, spoke again. "I will tell him you were here, but you must not blame me if he does not choose to see you. We don't feel you've behaved well about that girl. Letty is my friend. I have behaved to her as if she were my sister. You had no business to behave to her as if she were your sister. You had no right to tempt her down to your level. Is it degradation to earn one's own living? You had nothing to do with her. She would have done very well if you had but let her alone. Excuse me, ma'am, but I have some right in Letty. I am sorry to have to assert it, but she would have been dead long ago if I had behaved to her as you would have me. That was all her own fault. I will not talk with you about it. You do not know the circumstances to which I refer. I request to see Mr. Wardour. I have no time to waste in useless altercation." Mary was angry, and it did her good. It made her fitter to face the harder task before her. That moment they heard the step of Godfrey approaching through a long passage in the rear. His mother went into the parlor, leaving the door, which was close to where Mary stood, ajar. Godfrey, reaching the hall, saw Mary, and came up to her with a formal bow, and a face flushed with displeasure. "May I speak to you alone, Mr. Wardour?" said Mary. "Can you not say what you have to say here? It is impossible." "Then I am curious to know." "Let your curiosity plead for me, then." With a sigh of impatience he yielded, and led the way to the drawing-room, which was at the other end of the hall. Mary turned and shut the door he left open. "Why all this mystery, Miss Marston?" he said. "I am not aware of anything between you and me that can require secrecy." He spoke with unconcealed scorn. "When I have made my communication, you will at least allow secrecy to have been necessary." "Some objects may require it," said Wardour, in a tone itself an insult. "Mr. Wardour," returned Mary, "I am here for your sake, not my own. May I beg you will not render a painful duty yet more difficult? May I beg, then, that you will be as brief as possible? I am more than doubtful whether what you have to say will seem to me of so much consequence as you suppose." "I shall be very glad to find it so." "I cannot give you more than 10 minutes." Mary looked at her watch. "You have lately become acquainted with Miss Yolland, I am told," she began. "Phew!" whistled Godfrey, yet hardly as if he were surprised. "I have been compelled to know a good deal of that lady. As lady's maid in her family, I believe." "Yes," said Mary, and then, changing her tone after a slight pause, went on, "Mr. Wardour, I owe you more than I can ever thank you for. I strongly desire to fulfill the obligation your goodness has laid upon me, though I can never discharge it. For the sake of that obligation, for your sake, I am risking much, namely, your opinion of me." He made a gesture of impatience. "I know Miss Yolland to be a woman without principle. I know it by the testimony of my own eyes, and from her own confession. She is capable of playing a cold-hearted, cruel game for her own ends. Be persuaded to consult Mr. Redmain before you commit yourself. Ask him if Miss Yolland is fit to be the wife of an honest man." There was nothing in Godfrey's countenance but growing rage. Turning to the door, Mary would have gone without another word. "Stay," said Godfrey, in a voice of suppressed fury. "Do not dare to go until I have told you that you are a vile slanderer. I knew something of what I had to expect, but you should never have entered this room had I known how far your effrontery could carry you. Listen to me. If anything more than the character of your statement had been necessary to satisfy me of the falsehood of every word of it, you have given it to me in your reference to Mr. Redmain, a man whose life has rendered him unfit for the acquaintance, not to say the confidence, of any decent woman. This is a plot, for what final object God knows, between you and him. I should be doing my duty were I to expose you both to the public scorn that you deserve." "Now I am clear," said Mary to herself, but aloud, and stood erect, with glowing face and eyes of indignation. "Then why not do your duty, Mr. Wardour? I should be glad of anything that would open your eyes, but Miss Yolland will never give Mr. Redmain such an opportunity, nor does he desire it, for he might have had it long ago by the criminal prosecution of a friend of hers. For my part, I should be sorry to see her brought to public shame." "Leave the house," said Godfrey through his teeth, almost under his breath. "I am sorry it is so hard to distinguish between truth and falsehood," said Mary as she went to the door. She walked out, got into the fly, and drove home, went into the shop, and served the rest of the morning, but in the afternoon was obliged to lie down, and did not appear again for 3 days. The reception she had met with did not much surprise her. Plainly, Sepia had been before her. She had pretended to make Godfrey her confidant, had invented, dressed, and poured out injuries to him, and so blocked up the way to all testimony unfavorable to her. Was there ever man in more pitiable position? In addition to Godfrey's rage that he had not a doubt Mary knew what had passed between Letty and him, that, he reasoned, was at the root of it all. She wanted to bring them together, yet it would be a fine thing for her to have her bosom friend mistress of Thornwick. What a cursed thing he should ever have been civil to her, and what a cursed fool he was ever to have cared a straw for such a low-minded creature as that Letty. Thank heaven he was cured of that. Cured? He had fallen away from love. That was all the cure. Like the Knight of the Red Cross, he was punished for abandoning Una by falling in love with Duessa. His rage against Letty, just because of her faithfulness, had cast him an easy prey into the arms of the clinging Sepia. And now what more could Mary do? Just one thing was left. Mr. Redmain could satisfy Mr. Wardour of the fact he would not hear from her. So at least thought Mary yet. If Mr. Redmain would take the trouble to speak to him, Mr. Wardour must be convinced. However true might be what Mr. Wardour had said about Mr. Redmain, fact remained fact about Sepia. She sat down and wrote the following letter. Sir, I hardly know how to address you without seeming to take a liberty. At the same time, I cannot help hoping that you'll trust me enough to believe that I would not venture such a request as I am about to make without good reason. Should you kindly judge me not to presume, and should you be well enough in health, which I fear may not be the case, would you mind coming to see me here in my shop? I think you must know it. It used to be Turnbull and Marston. The Marston was my father. You will see my name over the door. Any hour from morning to night will do for me. Only please let it be as soon as you can make it convenient. I am, sir, your humble and grateful servant, Mary Marston. What the deuce is she grateful to me for? Grumbled Mr. Redmain when he read it. I never did anything for her. By Jove, the gypsy herself wouldn't let me. I vow she's got more brains of her own than any half-dozen women I ever had to do with before. The least thing bearing the look of plot or intrigue or secret to be discovered or heard was enough for Mr. Redmain. What he had of pride was not of the same sort as Wardour's. It made no pretense to dignity and was less antagonistic, so long at least as there was no talk of good motive or righteous purpose. Far from being offended with Mary's request, he got up at once, though indeed he was rather unwell and dreading an attack, ordered his brougham, and drove to Testbridge. There, careful of secrecy, he went to several shops and bought something at each, but pretended not to find the thing he wanted. He said then he would lunch at the inn, told his coachman to put up, and while his meal was getting ready, went to Mary's shop, which was but a few doors off. There he asked for a certain outlandish stuff, and insisted on looking over a bale not yet unpacked. Mary understood him, and, whispering Letty to take him to the parlor, followed a minute after. As soon as she entered, "Come now, what's it all about?" he said. Mary began at once to tell him, as directly as she could, that she was under obligation to Mr. Wardour of Thornwick, and that she had reason to fear Miss Yolland was trying to get a hold of him, and you know what that would mean for any man, she said. "No, by Jove, I don't," he answered. "What would it be?" "Utter ruin," replied Mary. "Then go and tell him so, if you want to save him." "I have told him, but he doesn't like me and won't believe me." "Then let him take his own course and be ruined." "But I've just told you, sir, I am under obligation to him, great obligation." "Oh, I see, you want him yourself. Well, as you wish it. I would rather you should have him than the she-devil. But come now, you must be open with me." "I am. I will be." "You say so, of course. Women do. But you confess you want him yourself." Mary saw it would be the worst possible policy to be angry with him, especially as she had given him the trouble to come to her, and she must not lose this her last chance. "I do not want him," she answered with a smile, "and if I did, he would never look at one in my position. He would as soon think of marrying the daughter of one of his laborers, and quite right too, for the one might just be as good as the other." "Well, now, that's a pity. I would have done a good deal for you. I don't know why, for you're a little humbug if ever there was one, but if you don't care about the fellow, I don't see why I should take the trouble. Confess you're a little bit in love with him, ain't you now? Confess to that, and I will do what I can." "I can't confess to a lie. I owe Mr. Wardour a debt of gratitude, that is all, but no light thing, you will allow, sir." "I don't know. I never tried its weight. Anyhow, I should make haste to be rid of it." I have sought to make him this return, but he only fancies me a calumniator. Miss Yolland has been beforehand with me." "Then, by Jove, I don't see but you're quite with him. If he behaves like that to you, don't you see, it wipes it all out. Upon my soul, I don't see why you should trouble your head about him. Let him take his way and go to Sepia." "But, sir, what a dreadful thing it would be, knowing what she is, to let a man like him throw himself away on her." "I don't see it. I've no doubt he's just as bad as she is. We all are. We're all the same, and if we weren't, it would be the better joke. Besides, you oughtn't to keep up a grudge. Don't you know, you ought to let the woman have a chance. If he marries her, and that must be her game this time, she'll grow decent and be respectable ever after, you may be sure. Go to church as you would have her, and all that. Never miss a Sunday, I'll lay you 1,000. "He's of a good old family," said Mary, foolishly, thinking that would weigh with him. "Good old fiddlestick! Damned old worn-out broom-end! She's of a good old family, quite good enough for his, you may take your oath. Why, my girl, the thing's not worth burning your fingers with. You've brought me here on a goose errand. I'll go and have my lunch." He rose. "I'm sorry to have vexed you, sir," said Mary, greatly disappointed. "Never mind. I'm horribly sold," he said, with a tight grin. "I thought you must have some good thing in hand to make it worth your while to send for me." "Then I must try something else," reflected Mary aloud. "I wouldn't advise you. The man's only the surer to hate you and stick to her. Let him alone. If he's a stuck-up fellow like that, it will take him down a bit when the truth comes out, that is, as come out it must. There's one good thing in it. My wife will get rid of her, but I don't know. There's an enemy, as the Bible says, that sticketh closer than a brother, and they'll be next door when Durnmelling is mine, but I can sell it. If he should come to you, will you tell him the truth?" "I don't know that. It might spoil my own little game." "Will you let him think me a liar and slanderer?" "No, by Jove, I won't do that. I don't promise to tell him all the truth, or even that what I do tell him shall be exactly true. But I won't let him think ill of my little Puritan. That would spoil your game. Ta-ta." He went out with his curious grin, amused and enjoying the idea of a proud fellow like that being taken in with Sepia. "I hope devoutly he'll marry her," he said to himself as he went to his luncheon. "Then I shall hold a rod over them both, and perhaps buy that miserable little Thornwick. Mortimer would give the skin off his back for it." The thing that ought to be done had to be done, and Mary had done it, alas, to no purpose for the end desired. What was left her to do further? She could think of nothing. Sepia, like a moral hyena, must range her night. She went to bed and dreamed she was pursued by a crowd, hooting after her and calling her all the terrible names of those who spread evil reports. She woke in misery and slept no more. End of chapter 51. A hard task.
Chapter 52 of Mary Marston. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Amanda Friday. Mary Marston by George MacDonald. Chapter 52. A Summons. One hot Saturday afternoon, in the sleepiest time of the day, when nothing was doing, and nobody in the shop, except a poor boy who had come begging for some string to help him fly his kite, though for the last month wind had been more scarce than string, Jemima came in from Durnmelling, and greeting Mary with the warmth of the friendship that had always been true between them, gave her a letter. "Whom is this from?" asked Mary, with the usual human waste of inquiry, seeing she held the surest answer in her hand. "Mr. Mewks gave it to me," said Jemima. "He didn't say whom it was from." Mary made haste to open it. She had an instinctive distrust of everything that passed through Mewks's hands, and greatly feared that, much as his master trusted him, he was not true to him. She found the following note from Mr. Redmain: "Dear Miss Marston, come and see me as soon as you can. I have something to talk to you about. Send word by the bearer when I may look for you. I am not well. Yours truly, F. G. Redmain." Mary went to her desk and wrote a reply, saying she would be with him the next morning about 11 o'clock. She would have gone that same night, she said, but as it was Saturday, she could not, because of country customers, close in time to go so far. "Give it to Mr. Redmain's own hand, if you can, Jemima," she said. "I will try, but I doubt if I can, miss," answered the girl. "Between ourselves, Jemima," said Mary, "I do not trust that man Mewks." "Nobody does, miss, except the master and Miss Yolland." "Then," thought Mary, "the thing is worse than I had supposed." "I'll do what I can, miss," Jemima went on. "But he's so sharp Mr. Mewks, I mean." After she was gone, Mary wished she had given her a verbal message, that she might have insisted on delivering in person. Jemima, with circumspection, managed to reach Mr. Redmain's room unencountered, but just as she knocked at the door, Mewks came behind her from somewhere, and snatching the letter out of her hand, for she carried it ready to justify her entrance to the first glance of her irritable master, pushed her rudely away, and immediately went in. But as he did so, he put the letter in his pocket. "Who took the note?" asked his master. "The girl at the lodge, sir." "Is she not come back yet?" "No, sir, not yet. She'll be in a minute, though. I saw her coming up the avenue." "Go and bring her here." "Yes, sir." Mewks went, and in 2 minutes returned with the letter, and the message that Miss Marston hadn't time to direct it. "You damned rascal! I told you to bring the messenger here." "She ran the whole way, sir, and not being very strong was that tired that, the moment she got in, the poor thing dropped in a dead faint. They ain't got to her yet." His master gave him one look straight in the eyes, then opened the letter and read it. "Miss Marston will call here to-morrow morning," he said. "See that she is shown up at once, here to my sitting room. I hope I am explicit." When the man was gone, Mr. Redmain nodded his head 3 times, and grinned the skin tight as a drumhead over his cheek bones. "There isn't a damned soul of them to be trusted," he said to himself, and sat silently thoughtful. Perhaps he was thinking how often he had come short of the hope placed in him. Times of reflection arrived to most men, and a threatened attack of the illness he believed must one day carry him off might well have disposed him to think. In the evening he was worse. By midnight he was in agony, and Lady Margaret was up with him all night. In the morning came a lull, and Lady Margaret went to bed. His wife had not come near him. But Sepia might have been seen, more than once or twice, hovering about his door. Both she and Mewks thought, after such a night, he must have forgotten his appointment with Mary. When he had had some chocolate, he fell into a doze, but his sleep was far from profound. Often he woke and again dozed off. The clock in the dressing-room struck 11. "Show Miss Marston up the moment she arrives," he said, and his voice was almost like that of a man in health. "Yes, sir," replied the startled Mewks, and felt he must obey. So Mary was at once shown to the chamber of the sick man. To her surprise, for Mewks had given her no warning, he was in bed, and looking as ill as ever she had seen him. His small head was like a skull covered with parchment. He made the slightest of signs to her to come nearer, and again. She went close to the bed. Mewks sat down at the foot of it, out of sight. It was a great 4-post bed with curtains. "I'm glad you're come," he said, with a feeble grin, all he had for a smile. "I want to have a little talk with you. But I can't while that brute is sitting there. I've been suffering horribly. Look at me and tell me if you think I'm going to die. Not that I take your opinion for worth anything. That's not what I wanted you for, though. I wasn't so ill then. But I want you the more to talk to now. You have a bit of a heart, even for people that don't deserve it. At least I'm going to believe you have. And if I am wrong, I almost think I would rather not know it till I'm dead and gone. Good God, where shall I be then?" I have already said, that whether in consequence of remnants of mother teaching, or from the movements of a conscience that had more vitality than any of his so-called friends would have credited it with, Mr. Redmain, as often as his sufferings reached a certain point, was subject to fits of terror, horrible anguish it sometimes amounted to, at the thought of hell. This, of course, was silly, seeing hell is out of fashion in far wider circles than that of Mayfair, but denial does not alter fact, and not always fear. Mr. Redmain laughed when he was well, and shook when he was suffering. In vain he argued with himself that what he held by when in health was much more likely to be true than a dread which might be but the suggestion of the disease that was slowly gnawing him to death. As often as the sickness returned, he received the suggestion afresh, whatever might be its source, and trembled as before. In vain he accused himself of cowardice. The thing was there, in him; nothing could drive it out. And verily, even a madman may be wiser than the prudent of this world, and the courage of not a few would forsake them, if they dared but look the danger in the face. I pity the poor ostrich, and must I admire the man of whose kind he is the type, or take him in any sense for a man of courage? Wait till the thing stares you in the face, and then, whether you be a brave man or coward, you will at all events care little about courage or cowardice. The nearer a man is to being a true man, the sooner will conscience of wrong make a coward of him, and herein Redmain had a far-off kindred with the just. After the night he had passed, he was now in one of his terror fits, and this much may be said for his good sense, that if there was anywhere a hell for the use of anybody, he was justified in anticipating a free entrance. "Mewks!" he called, suddenly, and his tone was loud and angry. Mewks was by his bedside instantly. "Get out with you! If I find you in this room again, without having been called, I will kill you. I am strong enough for that, even without this pain. They won't hang a dying man, and where I'm going, they will rather like it." Mewks vanished. "You need not mind, my girl," he went on to Mary. "Everybody knows I am ill, very ill. Sit down there, on the foot of the bed, only take care you don't shake it, and let me talk to you. People, you know, say nowadays there ain't any hell, or perhaps none to speak of." "I should think the former more likely than the latter," said Mary. "You don't believe there is any? I am glad of that, for you are a good girl and ought to know." "You mistake me, sir. How can I imagine there is no hell when he said there was?" "Who's he?" "The man who knows all about it, and means to put a stop to it some day." "Oh, yes, I see. But I don't for the life of me see what a fellow is to make of it all. Don't you know? Those parsons, they will have it there's no way out of it but theirs, and I never could see a handle anywhere to that door." "I don't see what the parsons have got to do with it, or at least what you have got to do with the parsons. If a thing is true, you have as much to do with it as any parson in England. If it is not true, neither you nor they have anything to do with it." "But I tell you, if it be all as true as that we are all sinners, I don't know what to do with it." "It seems to me a simple thing. That man as much as said he knew all about it, and came to find men that were lost and take them home." "He can't well find one more lost than I am. But how am I to believe it? How can it be true? It's ages since he was here, if ever he was here at all. And there hasn't been a sign of him ever since, all the time." "There you may be quite wrong. I think I could find you some who believe him just as near them now as ever he was to his own brothers, believe that he hears them when they speak to him, and heeds what they say." "That's bosh! You would have me believe against the evidence of my senses." "You must have strange senses, Mr. Redmain, that give you evidence where they can't possibly know anything. If that man spoke the truth when he was in the world, he is near us now. If he is not near us, there is an end of it all." "The nearer he is, the worse for me," sighed Mr. Redmain. "The nearer he is, the better for the worst man that ever breathed." "That's queer doctrine. Mind you, I don't say it mayn't be all right. But it does seem a cowardly thing to go asking him to save you, after you've been all your life doing what ought to damn you. If there be a hell, mind you, that is." "But think," said Mary, "if that should be your only chance of being able to make up for the mischief you've done? No punishment you can have will do anything for that. No suffering of yours will do anything for those you have made suffer. But it is so much harder to leave the old way than to go on and let things take their chance." "There may be something in what you say, but still I can't see it anything better than sneaking to do a world of mischief, and then slink away into heaven, leaving all the poor wretches to look after themselves." "I don't think Jesus Christ is worse pleased with you for feeling like that," said Mary. "Eh? What? What's that you say? Jesus Christ worse pleased with me? That's a good one. As if he ever thought about a fellow like me." "If he did not, you would not be thinking about him just this minute, I suspect. There's no sense in it, if he does not think about you. He said himself he didn't come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." "I wish I could repent." "You can, if you will." "I can't make myself sorry for what's gone and done with." "No, it wants him to do that. But you can turn from your old ways and ask him to take you for a pupil. Aren't you willing to learn, if he be willing to teach you?" "I don't know. It's all so dull and stupid. I never could bear going to church." "It's not one bit like that. It's like going to your mother and saying you're going to try to be a good boy and not vex her any more." "I see. It's all right, I dare say. But I've had as much of it as I can stand. You see, I'm not used to such things. You go away and send Mewks. Don't be far off, though, and mind you, don't go home without letting me know. There, go along." She had just reached the door when he called her again. "I say, mind whom you trust in this house. There's no harm in Mrs. Redmain. She only grows stupid directly she don't like a thing. But that Miss Yolland, that woman's the devil. I know more about her than you or any one else. I can't bear her to be about Hesper. But, if I told her the half I know, she would not believe the half of that. I shall find a way, though. But I am forgetting. You know her as well as I do. That is, you would, if you were wicked enough to understand. I will tell you one of these days what I'm going to do. There, don't say a word. I want no advice on such things. Go along and send Mewks. With all his suspicion of the man, Mr. Redmain did not suspect how false Mewks was. He did not know that Miss Yolland had bewitched him, for the sake of having an ally in the enemy's camp. All he could hear, and the dressing-room door was handy, the fellow duly reported to her. Already, instructed by her fears, she had almost divined what Mr. Redmain meant to do. Mary went and sat on the lowest step of the stair just outside the room. "What are you doing there?" said Lady Margaret, coming from the corridor. "Mr. Redmain will not have me go yet, my lady," answered Mary, rising. "I must wait first till he sends for me." Lady Margaret swept past her, murmuring, "Most peculiar." Mary sat down again. In about an hour Mewks came and said his master wanted her. He was very ill and could not talk, but he would not let her go. He made her sit where he could see her, and now and then stretched out his hand to her. Even in his pain he showed a quieter spirit. "Something may be working. Who can tell?" thought Mary. It was late in the afternoon, when at length he sought further conversation. "I have been thinking, Mary," he said, "that if I do wake up in hell when I die, no matter how much I deserve it, nobody will be the better for it, and I shall be all the worse." He spoke with coolness, but it was by a powerful effort. He had waked from a frightful dream, drenched from head to foot. Coward? No, he had reason to fear. "Whereas," rejoined Mary, taking up his clue, "everybody will be the better if you keep out of it. Everybody," she repeated. "God and Jesus Christ and all their people." "How do you make that out?" he asked. "God has more to do than look after such as me." "You think he has so many worlds to look to, thousands of them only making? But why does he care about his worlds? Is it not because they are the schools of his souls? And why should he care for the souls? Is it not because he is making them children, his own children, to understand him and be happy with his happiness?" "I can't say I care for his happiness. I want my own, and yet I don't know any that's worth the worry of it. No, I would rather be put out like a candle." "That's because you've been a disobedient child, taking your own way, and turning God's good things to evil. You don't know what a splendid thing life is. You actually and truly don't know, never experienced in your being the very thing you were made for." "My father had no business to leave me so much money." "You had no business to misuse it." "I didn't quite know what I was doing." "You do now." Then came a pause. "You think God hears prayer? Do you?" "I do." "Then I wish you would ask him to let me off. I mean to let me die right out when I do die. What's the good of making a body miserable?" "That I am sure it would be of no use to pray for. He certainly would not throw away a thing he has made, because that thing may be foolish enough to prefer the dust hole to a cabinet." "Wouldn't you do it now if I asked you?" "I would not. I would leave you in God's hands rather than inside the gate of heaven." "I don't understand you, and you wouldn't say so if you cared for me. Only, why should you care for me?" "I would give my life for you." "Come, now, I don't believe that." "Why, I couldn't be a Christian if I wouldn't." "You are getting absurd," he cried, but he did not look exactly as if he thought it. "Absurd!" repeated Mary. "Isn't that what makes him our Saviour? How could I be his disciple if I wouldn't do as he did?" "You are saying a good deal." "Can't you see that I have no choice?" "I wouldn't do that for anybody under the sun." "You are not his disciple. You have not been going about with him." "And you have?" "Yes, for many years. Besides, I cannot help thinking there is one for whom you would do it." "If you mean my wife, you never were more mistaken. I would do nothing of the sort." "I did not mean your wife. I meant Jesus Christ." "Oh, I dare say! Well, perhaps, if I knew him as you do, and if I were quite sure he wanted it done for him." "He does want it done for him, always and every day. Not for his own sake, though it does make him very glad. To give up your way for his is to die for him. And when any one will do that, then he's able to do everything for him. For then, and not till then, he gets such a hold of him that he can lift him up, and set him down beside himself. That's how my father used to teach me, and now I see it for myself to be true. That's how my father used to teach me, and now I see it for myself to be true." "It's all very grand, no doubt, but it ain't nowhere, you know. It's all in your own head, and nowhere else. You can't positively believe all that." "So much, at least, that I live in the strength and hope it gives me, and order my ways according to it."
"Why didn't you teach my wife so?"
"I tried, but she didn't care to think. I could not get any further with her. She has had no trouble yet to make her listen."
"By Jove! I should have thought marrying a fellow like me might have been trouble enough to make a saint of her."
It was impossible to fix him to any line of thought, and Mary did not attempt it. To move the child in him was more than all argument. A pause followed. "I don't love God," he said. "I dare say not," replied Mary. "How should you, when you don't know him?" "Then what's to be done? I can't very well show myself where I hate the master of the house." "If you knew him, you would love him." "You are judging by yourself. But there is as much difference between you and me as between light and darkness." "Not quite that," replied Mary, with one of those smiles that used to make her father feel as if she were that moment come fresh from God to him. "If you knew Jesus Christ, you could not help loving him, and to love him is to love God." "You wear me out! Will you never come to the point? Know Jesus Christ? How am I to go back 2,000 years?" "What he was then he is now," answered Mary. "And you may even know him better then than they did at the time who saw him, for it was not until they understood him better, by his being taken from them, that they wrote down his life." "I suppose you mean I must read the New Testament?" said Mr. Redmain, pettishly. "Of course," answered Mary, a little surprised, for she was unaware how few have a notion what the New Testament is, or is meant for. "Then why didn't you say so at first? There I have you! That's just where I learn that I must be damned forever." "I don't mean the epistles, those you can't understand yet." "I'm glad you don't mean them. I hate them." "I don't wonder. You've never seen a single shine of what they are, and what most people think them is hardly the least like them. What I want you to read is the life and death of the Son of Man, the Master of men." "I can't read. I should only make myself twice as ill. I won't try." "But I will read it to you, if you will let me." "How comes it you are such a theologian? A woman is not expected to know about that sort of thing." "I am no theologian. There just comes one of the cases in which those who call themselves his followers do not believe what the Master said. He said God hid these things from the wise and prudent, and revealed them to babes. I had a father who was child enough to know them, and I was child enough to believe him, and so grew able to understand them for myself. The whole secret is to do the thing the Master tells you. Then you will understand what he tells you. The opinion of the wisest man, if he does not do the things he reads, is not worth a rush. He may be partly right, but you have no reason to trust him." "Well, you shall be my chaplain. To-morrow, if I'm able to listen, you shall see what you can make of the old sinner." Mary did not waste words. Where would have been the use of pulling up the poor spiritual clodpole at every lumbering step, at any word inconsistent with the holy manners of the high countries? Once get him to court, and the power of the presence would subdue him, and make him over again from the beginning, without which absolute renewal, the best observance of religious etiquette, is worse than worthless. Many good people are such sticklers for the proprieties. For myself, I take joyous refuge with the grand, simple, everyday humanity of the man I find in the story, the man with the heart like that of my father, and my mother, and my brothers and sisters. If I may but see and help to show him a little as he lived to show himself, and not as church talk, and church ways, and church ceremonies, and church theories, and church plans of salvation, and church worldliness generally have obscured him for hundreds of years, and will yet obscure him for hundreds more." Toward evening, when she had just rendered him one of the many attentions he required, and which there was no one that day but herself to render, for he would scarcely allow Mewks to enter the room, he said to her, "Thank you. You are very good to me. I shall remember you. Not that I think I'm going to die just yet. I've often been as bad as this, and got quite well again. Besides, I want to show that I have turned over a new leaf. Don't you think God will give me one more chance, now that I really mean it? I never did before." "God can tell whether you mean it without that," she answered, not daring to encourage him where she knew nothing. "But you said you would remember me, Mr. Redmain. I hope you didn't mean in your will." "I did mean in my will," he answered, but in a tone of displeasure. "I must say, however, I should have preferred you had not shown quite such an anxiety about it. I shan't be in my coffin to-morrow, and I'm not in the way of forgetting things." "I beg you," returned Mary, flushing, "to do nothing of the sort. I have plenty of money, and don't care about more. I would much rather not have any from you." "But think how much good you might do with it," said Mr. Redmain, satirically. "It was come by honestly, so far as I know." "Money can't do half the good people think. It is stubborn stuff to turn to any good, and in this case it would be directly against good." "Nobody has a right to refuse what comes honestly in his way. There's no end to the good that may be done with money, to judge, at least, by the harm I've done with mine," said Mr. Redmain, this time with seriousness. "It is not in it," persisted Mary. "If it had been, our Lord would have used it, and he never did." "Oh, but he was all an exception." On the contrary, he is the only man who is no exception. We are the exceptions. Every one but him is more or less out of the straight. Do you not see? He is the very one we must all come to be the same as, or perish. No, Mr. Redmain, don't leave me any money, or I shall be altogether bewildered what to do with it. Mrs. Redmain would not take it from me. Miss Yolland might, but I dare not give it to her, and for societies I have small faith in them." "Well, well, I'll think about it," said Mr. Redmain, who had now got so far on the way of life as to be capable of believing that when Mary said a thing she meant it, though he was quite incapable of understanding the true relations of money. Few indeed are the Christians capable of that. The most of them are just where Peter was, when the moment after the Lord had honored him as the first to recognize him as the Messiah, he took upon him to object altogether to his Master's way of working salvation in the earth. The Roman emperors took up Peter's plan, and the devil has been in the church ever since. Peter's Satan, whom the Master told to get behind him. They are poor prophets, and no martyrs, who honor money as an element of any importance in the salvation of the world. Hunger itself does incomparably more to make Christ's kingdom come than ever money did, or ever will do while time lasts. Of course money has its part, for everything has, and whoever has money is bound to use it as best he knows, but his best is generally an attempt to do saint work by devil proxy. "I can't think where on earth you got such a sackful of extravagant notions," Mr. Redmain added. "I told you before, sir, I had a father who set me thinking," answered Mary. "I wish I had had a father like yours," he rejoined. "There are not many such to be had." "I fear mine wasn't just what he ought to be, though he can't have been such a rascal as his son. He hadn't time. He had his money to make." "He had the temptation to make it, and you have the temptation to spend it. Which is the more dangerous, I don't know. Each has led to many crimes." "Oh, as to crimes, I don't know about that. It depends on what you call crimes." "It doesn't matter whether men call a deed a crime or a fault. The thing is how God regards it, for that is the only truth about it. What the world thinks goes for nothing, because it is never right. It would be worse in me to do some things the world counts perfectly honorable, than it would be for this man to commit a burglary, or that a murder. I mean, my guilt might be greater in committing a respectable sin, than theirs in committing a disreputable one." Had Mary known anything of science, she might have said that in morals as in chemistry, the qualitative analysis is easy, but the quantitative another affair. The latter part of this conversation Sepia listening heard, and misunderstood utterly. All the rest of the day Mary was with Mr. Redmain, mostly by his bedside, sitting in silent watchfulness when he was unable to talk with her. Nobody entered the room except Mewks, who when he did seemed to watch everything, and try to hear everything, and once Lady Margaret. When she saw Mary seated by the bed, though she must have known well enough she was there, she drew herself up with grand English repellence, and looked scandalized. Mary rose, and was about to retire, but Mr. Redmain motioned her to sit still. "This is my spiritual adviser, Lady Margaret," he said. Her ladyship cast a second look on Mary, such as few but her could cast, and left the room. On into the gloom of the evening Mary sat. No one brought her anything to eat or drink, and Mr. Redmain was too much taken up with himself, soul and body, to think of her. She was now past hunger, and growing faint, when through the settled darkness the words came to her from the bed. "I should like to have you near me when I'm dying, Mary." The voice was a softer than she had yet heard from Mr. Redmain, and its tone went to her heart. "I will certainly be with you, if God please," she answered. "There is no fear of God," returned Mr. Redmain. "It's the devil will try to keep you away. But never you heed what any one may do or say to prevent you. Do your very best to be with me. By that time I may not be having my own way any more. Be sure, the first moment they can get the better of me, they will. And you mustn't place confidence in a single soul in this house. I don't say my wife would play me false so long as I was able to swear at her, but I wouldn't trust her one moment longer. You come and be with me in spite of the whole posse of them." "I will try, Mr. Redmain," she answered faintly. "But indeed you must let me go now, else I may be unable to come to-morrow." "What's the matter?" he asked hurriedly, half lifting his head with a look of alarm. "There's no knowing," he went on, muttering to himself, "what may happen in this cursed house." "Nothing," replied Mary, "but that I have not had anything to eat since I left home. I feel rather faint." "They've given you nothing to eat!" cried Mr. Redmain, but in a tone that seemed rather of satisfaction than displeasure. "Ring! No, don't!" "Indeed, I would rather not have anything now till I get home," said Mary. "I don't feel inclined to eat where I'm not welcome." "Right, right, right," said Mr. Redmain. "Stick to that. Never eat where you are not welcome. Go home directly. Only say when you will come tomorrow." "I can't very well during the day," answered Mary. "There is so much to be done, and I have so little help. But if you should want me, I would rather shut up the shop than not come." "There's no need for that. Indeed, I would much rather have you in the evening. The first of the night is worst of all. It's then the devils are out. Look here," he added, after a short pause, during which Mary, for as unfit as she felt, hesitated to leave him. "Being in business, you've got a lawyer, I suppose?" "Yes," she answered. "Then you go to him to-night the first thing, and tell him to come to me to-morrow, about noon. Tell him I am ill and in bed, and particularly want to see him, and he mustn't let anything they say keep him from me, not even if they tell him I am dead." "I will," said Mary, and stroking the thin hand that lay outside the counterpane, turned and left him. "Don't tell anyone you're gone," he called after her, with a voice far from feeble. "I don't want any of their damned company." End of chapter 52. Recording by Amanda Friday.
53 of Mary Marston. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rebecca Case. Mary Marston by George MacDonald. Chapter 53. A Friend in Need. Mary left the house and saw no one on her way. But it was better, she said to herself, that he should lie there untended than be waited on by unloving hands. The night was very dark. There was no moon, and the stars were hidden by thick clouds. She must walk all the way to Testbridge. She felt weak, but the fresh air was reviving. She did not know the way so familiarly as that between Thornwick and the town, but she would enter the latter before arriving at the common. She had not gone far when the moon rose, and from behind the clouds diminished the darkness a little. The first part of her journey lay along a narrow lane, with a small ditch, a rising bank, and a hedge on each side. About the middle of the lane was a farmyard, and a little way farther a cottage. Soon after passing the gate of the farmyard, she thought she heard steps behind her, seemingly soft and swift, and naturally felt a little apprehension. But her thoughts flew to the one hiding place for thoughts and hearts and lives, and she felt no terror. At the same time something moved her to quicken her pace. As she drew near the common, she heard the steps more plainly, still soft and swift, and almost wished she had sought refuge in the cottage she had just passed, only it bore no very good character in the neighborhood. When she reached the spot where the paths united, feeling a little at home, she stopped to listen. Behind her were the footsteps plain enough. The same moment the clouds thinned about the moon, and a pale light came filtering through upon the common in front of her. She cast one look over her shoulder, saw something turn a corner in the lane, and sped on again. She would have run, but there was no place of refuge now nearer than the corner of the turnpike road, and she knew her breath would fail her long before that. How lonely and shelterless the common looked. The soft, swift steps came nearer and nearer. Was that music she heard? She dared not stop to listen. But immediately thereupon was poured forth on the dim air such a stream of pearly sounds, as if all the necklaces of some heavenly choir of women angels were broken, and the beads came pelting down in a cataract of hurtless hail. From no source could they come save the bow and violin of Joseph Jasper? Where could he be? She was so rejoiced to know that he must be somewhere near, that, for very delight of unsecured safety, she held her peace, and had almost stopped. But she ran on again. She was now nigh the ruined hut from which my narrative has made the reader acquainted. In the meantime the moon had been growing out of the clouds, clearer and clearer. The hut came in sight, but the look of it was somehow altered, with an undefinable change, such as might appear on a familiar object in a dream. And leaning against the side of the door stood a figure she could not mistake for any other than her musician. Absorbed in his music, he did not see her. She called out, "Joseph! Joseph!" He started. threw his bow from him, tucked his violin under his arm, and bounded to meet her. She tried to stop, and at the same moment to look behind her. The consequence was that she fell, but safe in the smith's arms. That instant appeared a man running. He half stopped, and, turning from the path, took to the common. Jasper handed his violin to Mary and darted after him. The chase did not last a minute, and the man was nearly spent. Joseph seized him by the wrist, saw something glitter in his other hand, and turned sick. The fellow had stabbed him. With indignation, as if it were a snake that had bit him, the blacksmith flung from him the hand he held. The man gave a cry, staggered, recovered himself, and ran. Joseph would have followed again, but fell, and for a minute or two lost consciousness. When he came to himself, Mary was binding up his arm. "What a fool I am," he said, trying to get up, but yielding at once to Mary's prevention. "Ain't it ridiculous now, miss, that a man of my size, and ready to work a sledge with any smith in Yorkshire, should turn sick for a little bit of a job with a knife? But my father was just the same, and he was a stronger man than I'm like to be, I fancy." "It is no such wonder as you think," said Mary. "You have lost a good deal of blood." Her voice faltered. She had been greatly alarmed, and the more that she had not light enough to get the edges of the wound properly together. "You've stopped it, ain't you, miss?" "I think so." "Then I'll be after the fellow." "No, no, you must not attempt it. You must lie still a while." "But I don't understand it at all. That cottage used to be a mere hovel, without door or window. It can't be you live in it." "Aye, that I do, and it's not a bad place either," answered Joseph. "That's what I went to Yorkshire to get my money for. It's mine, bought and paid for." "But what made you think of coming here?" "Let's go into the smithy. House I won't presume to call it," said Joseph, "though it has a lean-to for the smith, and I'll tell you everything about it. But really, miss, you oughtn't to be out like this after dark. There's too many vagabonds about." With but little need of the help Mary yet gave him, Joseph got up, and led her to what was now a respectable little smithy, with forge and bellows, and anvil and bucket. Opening a door where there had been none, he brought a chair, and making her sit down, began to blow the covered fire on the hearth, where he had not long before boiled his kettle for his tea. Then closing the door, he lighted a candle, and Mary, looking around her, could scarcely believe the change that had come upon the miserable vacuity. Joseph sat down upon his anvil, and begged to know where she had just been, and how far she had run from the rascal. When he had learned something of the peculiar relations in which Mary stood to the family at Durnmelling, he began to think that there might have been something more in the pursuit than a chance ruffianly assault, and the greater were his regrets that he had not secured the miscreant. "Anyhow, miss," he said, "you'll never come from there alone in the dark again." "I understand you, Joseph," answered Mary, "for I know you would not have me leave doing what I can for the poor man up there, because of a little danger in the way." "No, that I don't, miss. That would be as much as to say you would do the will of God when the devil would let you. What I mean is, that here I am, your slave, or servant, or soldier, or whatever you may please to call me, ready at your word." "I must not take you from your work, you know, Joseph." "Work's not everything, miss," he answered, "and it's seldom so pressing that, except I be shoeing a horse, I can leave it whenever I choose. Any time you want to go anywhere, don't forget as you've got enemies about, and just send for me. You won't have long to wait till I come. But I am main sorry the rascal didn't have something to keep him in mind of his manners." Part of this conversation, and a good deal more, passed on their way to Testbridge, whither, as soon as Joseph seemed all right, Mary, who had forgotten her hunger and faintness, insisted on setting out at once. In her turn she questioned Joseph, and learned that, as soon as he knew she was going to settle at Testbridge, he started off to find if possible a place in the neighborhood, humble enough to be within his reach, and near enough for the hope of seeing her sometimes, and having what help she might please to give him. The explanation afforded Mary more pleasure than she cared to show. She had a real friend near her, one ready to help her on her own ground, one who understood her because he understood the things that she loved. He told her that already he had work enough to keep him going, that the horses he once shod were always brought to him again, that lie was at no expense such as in town, and that he had plenty of time both for his violin and his books. When they came to the suburbs, she sent him home, and went straight to Mr. Brett with Mr. Redmain's message. He undertook to be at Durnmelling at the time appointed, and to let nothing prevent him from seeing his new client. End of Chapter 53, A Friend in Need.
Chapter 54 of Mary Marston. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mary Marston by George MacDonald. Chapter 54. The Next Night. Mr. Brett found no difficulty in the way of the interview, for Mr. Redmain had given Mewks instructions he dared not disobey. His master had often ailed and recovered again, and he must not venture too far. As soon as he had shown the visitor into the room, he was dismissed, but not before he had satisfied himself that he was a lawyer. He carried the news at once to Sepia, and it wrought no little anxiety in the house. There was a will already in existence, and no ground for thinking a change in it boded anything good. Mr. Mortimer never deigned to share his thoughts, anxieties, or hopes with any of his people, but the ladies met in deep consultation, although of course there was nothing to be done. The only operative result was that it let Sepia know how, though for reasons somewhat different, her anxiety was shared by the others. Unlike theirs, her sole desire was not to be mentioned in the will. That could only for the sake of leaving her a substantial curse. Mr. Redmain's utter silence, after, as she well knew, having gathered damning facts to her discredit, had long convinced her he was but biding his time. Certain she was he would not depart this life without leaving his opinion of her, and the proofs of its justice behind him, carrying weight as the affidavit of a dying man. Also she knew Hesper well enough to be certain that, however she might delight in opposition to the desire of her husband, she would, for the sake of no one, carry that opposition to a point where it became injurious to her interests. Sepia's one thought therefore was, could not something be done to prevent the making of another will, or the leaving of any fresh document behind him? What he might already have done, she could nowise help. What he might yet do, it would be well to prevent. Once more, therefore, she impressed upon Mewks, and that in the names of Mrs. Redmain and Lady Margaret, as well as in her own person, the absolute necessity of learning as much as possible of what might pass between his master and the lawyer. Mewks was driven to the end of his wits, and they were not a few, to find excuses for going into the room, and for delaying to go out again, while with all his ears he listened. But both client and lawyer were almost too careful for him, and he had learned positively nothing when the latter rose to depart. He instantly left the room with the door a trifle ajar, and listening intently, heard his master say that Mr. Brett must come again the next morning, that he felt better, and would think over the suggestions he had made, and that he must leave the memoranda within his reach, on the table beside his bedside. Ere the lawyer issued, Mewks was on his way with all this to his tempter. Sepia concluded there had been some difference of opinion between Mr. Redmain and his adviser, and hoped that nothing had been finally settled. Was there any way to prevent the lawyer from seeing him again? Could she, by any means, get a peep at the memoranda mentioned? She dared not suggest the thing to Hesper or Lady Malice. Of all people they were those in relation to whom she feared their possible contents, and she dared not show herself in Mr. Redmain's room. Was Mewks to be trusted to the point of such danger as grew in her thought? The day wore on. Toward evening he had a dreadful attack. Any other man would have sent before now for what medical assistance the town could afford him, but Mr. Redmain hated having a stranger about him, and as he knew how to treat himself, it was only when very ill that he would send for his own doctor to the country, fearing that otherwise he might give him up as a patient, such visits, however well remunerated, being seriously inconvenient to a man with a large London practice. But now Lady Margaret took it upon herself to send a telegram. An hour before her usual time for closing the shop, Mary set out for Durnmelling, and at the appointed spot on the way found her squire of low degree in waiting. At first sight, however, and although she was looking out for him, she did not certainly recognize him. I would not have my readers imagine Joseph one of those fools who delight in appearing something else than they are. But while every workman ought to look a workman, it ought not to be by looking less of a man, or of a gentleman in the true sense. And Joseph, having out of respect to her who would honour him with her company, dressed himself in a new suit of unpretending grey, with a wide-awake hat, looked at first sight more like a country gentleman having a stroll over his farm than a man whose hands were hard with the labours of the forge. He took off his hat as she approached, if not with ease, yet with the clumsy grace peculiar to him, for unlike many whose manners are unobjectionable, he had in his something that might be called his own. But the best of it was that he knew nothing about his manners, beyond the desire to give honour where honour was due. He walked with her to the door of the house, for they had agreed that from whatever quarter had come the pursuit, and whatever might have been its object, it would be well to show that she was attended. They had also arranged at what hour and at what spot close at hand he was to be waiting to accompany her home. But although he said nothing about it, Joseph was determined not to leave the place until she rejoined him. It was nearly dark when he left her, and when he had wandered up and down the avenue a while, it seemed dark enough to return to the house and reconnoitre a little. He had already made the acquaintance of the farmer who occupied a portion of the great square, behind the part where the family lived. He had had several of his horses to shoe, and had not only given satisfaction by the way in which he shod them, but had interested their owner with descriptions of more than one rare mode of shoeing to which he had given attention. He was, therefore, the less shy of being discovered about the place. From the back he found his way into the roofless hall, and there paced quietly up and down, measuring the floor, and guessing at the height and thicknesses of the walls, and the sort of roof they had borne. He noted that the wall of the house rose higher than those of the ruin with which it was in contact, and that there was a window in it just over one of those walls. Thinking whether it had been there when the roof was on, he saw through it the flickering of a fire, and wondered whether it could be the window of Mr. Redmain's room. Mary, having resolved not to give any notice of her arrival, if she could get in without it, and finding the hall door on the latch, entered quietly and walked straight to Mr. Redmain's bedroom. When she opened the door of it, Mewks came hurriedly to meet her, as if he would have made her go out again, but she scarcely looked at him, and advanced to the bed. Mr. Redmain was just waking from the sleep into which he had fallen after a severe paroxysm. "Ah, there you are," he said, smiling her a feeble welcome. "I am glad you are come. I've been looking out for you. I'm very ill. If it comes again tonight, I think it will make an end of me." She sat down by the bedside. He lay quite still for some time, breathing like one very weary. Then he seemed to grow easier, and said, with much gentleness, "Can't you talk to me?" "Would you like me to read to you?" she asked. no," he answered. "I can't bear the light. It makes my head furious." "Shall I talk to you about my father?" she asked. "I don't believe in fathers," he replied. "They're always after some notion of their own. It's not their children they care about." "That may be true of some fathers," answered Mary, "but it's not the least true of mine." "Where is he? Why don't you bring him to see me? If he is such a good man, he might be able to do something for me." "There is none but your own father can do anything for you," said Mary. "My father has gone home to him, but if he were here, he would only tell you about him." There was a moment's silence. "Why don't you talk?" said Mr. Redmain crossly. "What's the good of sitting there saying nothing? How am I to forget that the pain will be here again if you don't say a word to help me?" Mary lifted up her heart and prayed for something to say to the sad human soul that had never known the Father, but she could think of nothing to talk about except the death of William Marston, so she began with the dropping of her watch, and telling whatever seemed at the moment fit to tell, ended with the dream she had the night of his funeral. By that time the hidden fountain was flowing in her soul, and she was able to speak straight out of it. "I cannot tell you, sir," she said, closing the story of her dream, "what a feeling it was. The joy of it was beyond all expression." "You're not surely going to offer me a dream in proof of anything?" muttered the sick man. "Yes," answered Mary, "in proof of what it can prove. The joy of a child over a new toy or a coloured sweetmeat shows of what bliss the human soul is capable." "Oh, capable, I dare say." "And more than that," Mary went on, adding instead of replying, "no one ever felt such gladness without believing in it. There must be somewhere the justification of such gladness. There must be the father of it somewhere." "Well, I don't like to say, after your kindness in coming here to take care of me, that you talk the worst rubbish I ever heard. But just tell me, of what use is it all to me, in the state I am in? What I want is to be free of pain, and have some pleasure in life, not to be told about a father." "But what if the father you don't want is determined you shall not have what you want? What if your desire is not worth keeping you alive for? And what if he is ready to help your smallest effort to be the thing he wants you to be, and in the end to give you your heart's desire?" "It sounds very fine, but it's all so thin, so up in the clouds. It don't seem to have a leg to stand upon. Why, if that were true, everybody would do good. They would be none but saints in the world. What's in it, I'm sure I don't know." "It will take ages to know what is in it, but if you should die now, you will be glad to find, on the other side, that you have made a beginning. For my part, if I had everything my soul could desire except God with me, I could but pray that he would come to me, or not let me live a moment longer, for it would be but the life of a devil." "What do you mean by a devil?" "A power that lives against its life," said Mary. Mr. Redmain answered nothing. He did not perceive an atom of sense in the words. They gave him not a glimmer. Neither will they to many of my readers, while not a few will think they see all that is in them, and see nothing. He was silent for a long time. Whether he waked or slept, she could not tell. The annoyance was great in the home conclave when Mewks brought the next piece of news, namely that there was that designing Marston in Master's room again, and however she got into the house, he was sure he didn't know. "All the same thing over again, miss. Hard at it trying to convert him, and where's the use, miss? If a man like my master's to be converted and get off, I don't for my part see where's the good of keeping up a devil." "I'm quite of your opinion, Mewks," said Sepia, but in her heart she was ill at ease. All day long she had been haunted with an ever recurring temptation, which, instead of dismissing it, she kept like a dog on a string. Different kinds of evil affect people differently. 10,000 will do a dishonest thing, who would indignantly reject the dishonest thing favoured by another 10,000. They are not sufficiently used to its ugly face not to dislike it, though it may not be quite so ugly as their protégé. A man will feel grandly honest against the dishonesties of another trade than his, and be eager to justify those of his own. Here was Sepia, who did not care the dust of a butterfly's wing for causing any amount of family misery, who would, without a pang, have sacrificed the genuine reputation of an innocent man to save her own false one, shuddering at an idea as yet bodiless in her brain, an idea which, however, she did not dismiss, and so grew able to endure. I have kept this woman, so far as personal acquaintance with her is concerned, in the background of my history. For one thing, I am not fond of post-mortem examinations. In other words, I do not like searching the decompositions of moral carrion. Analysis of such is, like the use of reagents on dirt, at least unpleasant. Nor was any true end to be furthered by a more vivid presentation of her. Nosology is a science doomed, thank God, to perish. Health alone will at last fill the earth, or if there should always be the ailing to help, a man will help them by being sound himself, not by knowing the ins and outs of disease. Diagnosis is not therapy. Sepia was unnatural, as everyone is unnatural who does not set his face in the direction of the true nature, but she had gone further in the opposite direction than many people have yet reached. At the same time, whoever has not faced about is on the way to a capacity for worse things than even our enemies would believe of us. Her very existence seemed to her now at stake, as if by his dying act Mr. Redmain should drive her from under Hesper's roof. What was to become of her? Durnmelling, too, would then be as certainly closed against her, and she would be compelled to take a situation, and teach music, which she hated, and French and German, which gave her no pleasure apart from certain strata of their literature, to insolent girls whom she would be constantly wishing to strangle, or stupid little boys who would bore her to death. Her very soul sickened at the thought, as well it might, for to have to do such service with such a heart as hers must indeed be a torment. All hope of marrying Godfrey Wardour would be gone, of course, did he but remain uncertain as to the truth or falsehood of a third part of what Mr. Redmain would record against her. He would never meet her again. Since the commencement of this last attack of Mr. Redmain's malady, she had scarcely slept, and now what Mewks reported rendered her nigh crazy. For some time she had been generally awake half the night, and all the last night she had been wandering here and there about the house, not unfrequently couched where she could hear every motion in Mr. Redmain's room. Haunted by fear, she in turn haunted her fear. She could not keep from staring down the throat of the pit. She was a slave of the morrow, the undefined, awful morrow, ever about to bring forth no one knows what. That morrow could she but forestall. If any should think that anxiety and watching must have so wrought on Sepia that she came to be no longer accountable for her actions, I will not oppose the kind conclusion. For my own part, until I shall have seen a man absolutely one with the source of his being, I do not believe I shall ever have seen a man absolutely sane. What many would point to as plainest proofs of sanity, I should regard as surest signs of the contrary. A sign of my own insanity, is it? Your insanity may be worse than mine, for you are aware of none, and I with mine do battle. I believe all insanity has moral as well as physical roots. But enough of this. There are questions we can afford to leave. Sepia had got very thin during these trying days. Her great eyes were larger yet, and filled with a troubled anxiety. Not paleness, for of that her complexion was incapable, but a dull pallor possessed her cheek. If one had met her as she roamed the house that night, he might well have taken her for some naughty ancestor, whose troubled conscience, not yet able to shake off the madness of some evil deed, made her wander still about the place where she had committed it. She believed in no supreme power, who cares that right should be done in his words. Here it may be some of my unbelieving acquaintances, foreseeing a lurid something on the horizon of my story, will be indignant that the capacity for crime should be thus associated with a denial of a live good, but it remains a mere fact that it is easier for a man to commit a crime when he does not fear a willed retribution. Tell me there is no merit in being prevented by fear. I answer, the talk is not of merit, as the world is, that is, as the race of men at present is. It is just as well that the man who has no merit, and never dreamed of any, should yet be a little hindered from cutting his neighbour's throat at his evil pleasure. No, I don't mean hindered by a lie. I mean hindered by the poorest apprehension of the grandest truth. Of those who do not believe, some have never had a noble picture of God presented to them, but whether their phantasm is of a mean God because they refuse him, or they refuse him because their phantasm of him is mean, who can tell? Anyhow, mean notions must come of meanness, and uncharitable as it may appear, I cannot but think there is a moral root to all chosen unbelief. But let God himself judge his own. With Sepia, what was best meant what was best for her, and best for her meant most after her liking. She had in her time heard a good deal about euthanasia, and had taken her share in advocating it. I do not assume this to be anything additional against her. One who does not believe in God may in such an advocacy indulge a humanity pitiful over the irremediable ills of the race, and being what she was no worse necessarily for advocating that than advocating cremation, which she did occasionally, I must confess, a little coarsely. But the notion of euthanasia may well work for evil in a mind that had not a thought for the case any more than for the betterment of humanity, or indeed for anything but its own consciousness of pleasure or comfort. Opinions, like drugs, work differently on different constitutions. Hence the man is foolish who goes scattering vague notions regardless of the soil on which they may fall. She was used to asking the question, "What's the good?" but always in respect of something she wanted out of her way. "What's the good of it an hour or two more if you're not enjoying it?" she said to herself again and again that Monday. "What's the good of living when life is pain, or fear of death, from which no fear can save you?" But the question had no reference to her own life. She was judging for another, and for another not for his sake, or from his point of view, but for her own sake and from where she stood. All the day she wandered about the house, such thoughts as these in her heart, and in her pocket a bottle of that concentrated which Mr. Redmain was taking much diluted for medicine. But she hoped not to have to use it. If only Mr. Redmain would yield the conflict and depart without another interview with the lawyer! But if he would not, and 2 drops from the said bottle, not taken by herself, but by another, would save her all her life to come from endless anxiety and grinding care, from weariness and disgust, and indeed from want, nor that alone, but save likewise that other, from an hour or 2 hours, or perhaps a week, or possibly 2 weeks, or who can tell? It might be a month of pain and moaning and weariness. Would it not be well? Must it not be more than well? She had not learned to fear temptation. She feared poverty, dependence, humiliation, labour, ennui, misery. The thought of the life that must follow and wrap her round in the case of the dreaded disclosure was unendurable. The thought of the suggested frustration was not so unendurable, was not absolutely unendurable, was to be borne, might be permitted to come, to return, was cogitated, now with imagined resistance, now with reluctant and partial acceptance, now with faint resolve, and now with determined resolution, now with the beaded drops pouring from the forehead, and now with a cold, scornful smile of triumphant foil and success. Was she so very exceptionally bad, however? You who hate your brother or your sister, you do not think yourself at all bad, but you are a murderer, and she was only a murderer. You do not feel wicked. How do you know she did? Besides, you hate, and she did not hate. She only wanted to take care of herself. Lady Macbeth did not hate Duncan. She only wanted to give her husband his crown. You only hate your brother. You would not, you say, do him any harm, and I believe you would not do him mere bodily harm. But were things changed so that hate action became absolutely safe, I should have no confidence what you might not come to do. No one can tell what wreck a gust of passion upon a sea of hate may work. There are men a man might well kill if he were anything less than ready to die for them. The difference between the man that hates and the man that kills may be nowhere but in the courage. These are gruesome thinkings. Let us leave them, but hating with them. All the afternoon Sepia hovered about Mr. Redmain's door, down upon Mewks every moment he appeared. Her head ached. She could hardly breathe. Rest she could not. Once, when Mewks, coming from the room, told her his master was asleep, she crept in, and softly approaching the head of the bed, looked at him from behind, then stole out again. "He seems dying, Mewks," she said. "Oh, no, miss. I've often seen him as bad. He's better." "Who's that whispering?" murmured the patient, angrily, though half asleep. Mewks went in and answered. "Only me and Jemima, sir." "Where's Miss Marston?" "She's not come yet, sir." "I want to go to sleep again. You must wake me the moment she comes." "Yes, sir." Mewks went back to Sepia. "His voice is much altered," she said. "He most always speaks like that now, miss, when he wakes. Very different from I used to know him. He always swear bad when he woke. But Miss Marston do seem to have got a good deal of that out of him. Anyhow, this last 2 days he's scarce swore enough to make it feel home-like." "It's death has got it out of him," said Sepia. "I don't think he can last the night through. Fetch me at once, and don't let that Marston into the room again, whatever you do." She spoke with the utmost emphasis, plainly clinching instructions previously given, then went slowly up the stair to her own room. Surely he would die tonight, and she would not be led into temptation. She would then have but to get a hold of the paper. What a hateful and unjust thing it was that her life should be in the power of that man, a miserable creature, himself hanging between life and death, that such as he should be able to determine her fate, and say whether she was to be comfortable or miserable all the rest of the life that was to outlast his so many years. It was absurd to talk of a providence. She must be her own providence. She stole again down the stair. Her cousin was in her room, safe with a novel, and there was Mewks, fast asleep in an easy-chair in the study, with the doors of the dressing-room and chamber ajar. She crept into the sick-room. There was the tumbler with the medicine, and her fingers were on the vial in her pocket. The dying man slept. She drew near the table by the bed. He stirred as if about to awake. Her limbs, her brain, seemed to rebel against her will. What folly it was! The man was not for this world a day longer. What could it matter whether he left it a few hours earlier or later? The drops on his brow rose from the pit of his agony. Every breath was a torture. It were a mercy to help him across the verge. If to more life, he would owe her thanks. if to endless rest, he would never accuse her. She took the vial from her pocket. A hand was on the lock of the door. She turned and fled through the dressing-room and study, waking Mewks as she passed. He, hurrying into the chamber, saw Mary already entered. When Sepia learned who it was that had scared her, she felt she could kill her with less compunction than Mr. Redmain. She hated her far worse. "You must get the viper out of the house, Mewks. It's all your fault she got into the room." "I'm sure I'm willing enough," he answered, "even if it wasn't you as to me, miss. But what am I to do? She's that brazen, you wouldn't believe it, miss. It wouldn't be becoming to tell you what I think that young woman fit to do." "I don't doubt it," responded Sepia. "But surely," she went on, "the next time he has an attack, and he's certain to have one soon, you will be able to get her hustled out." "No, miss, least of all just then. She'll make that a pretence for not going a yard from the bed. As if me, that's been about him so many years, didn't know what ought to be done with him in his paroxysms of pain better than the likes of her. Of all things I do loathe a row, miss, and the talk of it after, and sure I am that without a row we don't get her out of that room. The only way is to be quiet and seem to trust her, and watch for the chance of her going out, then shut her out and keep her out." "I believe you're right," returned Sepia, almost with a hope that no such opportunity might arrive, but at the same time growing more determined to take advantage of it if it should. Hence, partly it came that Mary met with no interruption to her watching and ministering. Mewks kept coming and going, watching her and waiting his opportunity. Mr. Redmain scarcely heeded him, only once and again saying in sudden anger, "What can that idiot be about? He might know by this time I'm not likely to want him so long as you are in the room." And, said Mary to herself, who knows what good the mere presence of one who trusts may be to him, even if he shouldn't seem to take much of what she says. Perhaps he may think of some of it after he's dead. Who knows? Patiently she sat and waited, full of help that would have flowed in a torrent, but which she felt only trickle from her heart, like a stream that is lost on the face of the rock down which it flows. All at once she bethought herself and looked at her watch. Joseph had been waiting for her more than an hour, and would not, she knew, if he stopped all night, go away without her. And for her, she could not forsake the poor man her presence seemed to comfort. He was now lying very still. She would slip out and send Joseph away, and be back before the patient, or anyone else, should miss her. She went softly from the room, and glided down the stairs and out of the house, seeing no one, but not unseen. Hardly was she from the room when the door of it was closed and locked behind her, and hardly from the house when the house door also was closed and locked behind her. But she heard nothing, and ran, without the least foreboding of mishap, to the corner where Joseph was to meet her. There he was, waiting as patiently as if the hour had not yet come. "I can't leave him, Joseph. My heart won't let me," she said. "I cannot go back before the morning. I will look in upon you as I pass." So saying, and without giving him time to answer, she bade him good night and ran back to the house, hoping to get in as before without being seen. But to her dismay she found the door already fast, and concluded the hour had arrived when the house was shut up for the night. She rang the bell, but there was no answer, for there was Mewks himself standing close behind the door, grinning like his master, an evil grin. As she knocked and rang in vain, the fact flashed upon her that she was intentionally excluded. She turned away, overwhelmed with a momentary despair. What was she to do? There stood Joseph. She ran back to him and told him they had shut her out. "It makes me miserable," she went on, "to think of the poor man calling me, and me nowhere to answer. The worst of it is, I seem the only person he has any faith in, and what I have been telling him about the father of us all, whose love never changes, will only seem the idler tale when he finds I am gone and nowhere to be found, as they're sure to tell him. There's no saying what lies they might tell him about my going. Rather than go, I will sit on the doorstep all night, just to be able to tell him in the morning that I never went home." "Why have they done that, do you think?" said Joseph. "I hardly dare allow myself to conjecture," answered Mary. "None of them like me but Jemima, not even Mrs. Redmain now. I'm afraid, for you see, I never got any of the good done her I wanted, and till something of that was done, she could not know how I felt toward her. I shouldn't a bit wonder if they fancy I have a design on his money, as if anybody, fit to call herself a woman, would condescend to such a thing. But when a woman would marry for money, she may well think as badly of another woman." "This is serious affair," said Joseph. "To have a dying man believe you false to him would be dreadful. We must find some way in. Let us go to kitchen door." "If Jemima happened to be near, then perhaps," rejoined Mary. "But if they want to keep me out, you may be sure Mewks has taken care of one door as well as another. He knows I'm not so easy to keep out." "If you did get in," said Joseph, speaking in a whisper as they went, "would you feel quite safe after this?" "I have no fear. I dare say they would lock me up somewhere if they could, before I got to Mr. Redmain's room. Once in, they would not dare touch me." "I shall not go out of hearing so long as you are in that house," said Joseph with decision. "Not until I have you out again do I leave the premises. If anything should make you feel uncomfortable, you cry out, miss, and I'll make a noise at that door that everybody at Thornwick over there shall hear me." "It's a very large house, Joseph. One might call in many a part of it, and never be heard out of doors. I don't think you could hear me from Mr. Redmain's room," said Mary with a little laugh, for she was amused as well as pleased at the protection Joseph would give her. "It's up 2 flights, and he chose it himself for the sake of being quiet when he was ill." As she spoke, they reached the door they sought, the most likely of all to be still open. It was fast and dark, as if it had not been unbolted for years. 1 or 2 more entrances they tried, but with no better success. "Come this way," whispered Joseph. "I know a place where we shall at least be out of their sight, and where we can plan at our leisure." He led her to the back entrance to the old hall. Alas, even that was closed. "Oh, this is disappointing," he said, "for if we were only in there, I think something might be done." "I believe I know a way," said Mary, and led him to a place near, used for a woodshed. At the top of a great heap of sticks and faggots was an opening in the wall that had once been a window or perhaps a door. "That, I know, is the wall of the tower," she said, "and there can be no difficulty in getting through there. Once in, it will be easy to reach the hall, that is, if the door of the tower is not locked." In an instant Joseph was at the top of the heap, and through the opening, hanging on and feeling with his feet. He found footing at no great distance, and presently Mary was beside him. They descended softly, and found the door into the hall wide open. "Can you tell me what window is that?" whispered Joseph. "Just above the top of wall?" "I cannot," answered Mary. "I never could go about this house as I did about Mr. Redmain's. My lady always looked so fierce if she saw me trying to understand the place. But why do you ask?" "You see flickering of a fire. Could it be Mr. Redmain's room?" "I cannot tell. I do not think it. That has no window in this direction, so far as I know, but I could not be certain." "Think how the stairs turn as you go up, and how the passages go to the room. Think in what direction you look every corner you turn. Then you will know better whether or not it might be." Mary was silent and thought. In her mind she followed every turn she had to take from the moment she entered the house till she got to the door of Mr. Redmain's room, and then thought how the windows lay when she entered it. Her conclusion was that one side of the room must be against the hall, but she could remember no window in it. "But," she added, "I never was in that room when I was here before, and the twice I have now been in it, I was too much occupied to take much notice of things about me. 2 windows, I know, look down into a quiet little corner of the courtyard where there is an old pump covered with ivy. I remember no other." "Is there any way of getting to top of that wall from this tower?" asked Joseph. "Certainly there is. People often walk around the top of those walls. They're more than thick enough for that." "Are you able to do it?" "Yes, quite. I've been around them more than once, but I don't like the idea of looking in at a window." "No more do I, miss. But you must remember, if it is his room, it will only be your eyes going where the whole of you has right to be, and if it should not be that room, they have driven you to it. Such a necessity will justify it." "You must be right," answered Mary, and turning, led the way up the stair of the tower, and through a gap in the wall out upon the top of the great walls. It was a sultry night. A storm was brooding between heaven and earth. The moon was not yet up, and it was so dark that they had to feel their way along the wall, glad of the protection of a fence of thick ivy on the outer side. Looking down into the court on the one hand, and across the hall to the lawn on the other, they saw no living thing in the light from various windows, and there was little danger of being discovered. In the gable was only the one window for which they were making. Mary went first, as better knowing the path, also as having the better right to look in. Through the window, as she went, she could see the flicker, but not the fire. All at once came a great blaze. It lasted but a moment, long enough, however, to let them see plainly into a small closet, the door of which was partly open. "That is the room, I do believe," whispered Mary. "There is a closet, but I was never in it." "If only window be not bolted," returned Joseph. The same instant Mary heard the voice of Mr. Redmain call in a tone of annoyance, "Mary! Mary Marston! I want you! Who is that in the room? Damn you, who are you?" "Let me pass you," said Joseph, and making her hold to the ivy, here spread onto the gable, he got between Mary and the window. The blaze was gone, and the fire was at its old flicker. The window was not bolted. He lifted the sash. A moment, and he was in. The next, Mary was beside him. Something, known to her only as an impulse, induced Mary to go softly to the door of the closet and peep into the room. She saw Hesper, as she thought, standing sideways to the closet by a chest of drawers invisible from the bed. A candle stood on the farther side of her. She held in one hand the tumbler from which repeatedly that evening Mary had given the patient his medicine. Into this she was pouring, with an appearance of care, something from a small dark bottle. With a sudden suspicion of foul play, Mary glided swiftly into the room and on to where she stood. It was Sepia. She started with a smothered shriek, turned white, and almost dropped the bottle. Then, seeing who it was, recovered herself. But such a look as she cast on Mary! Such a fire of hate as throbbed out of those great black eyes! Mary thought for a moment she would dart at her, but she turned away and walked swiftly to the door. Joseph, however, peeping in behind Mary, had caught a glimpse of the bottle and the tumbler, also of Sepia's face. Seeing her now retiring with the bottle in her hand, he sprang after her, and, thanks to the fact that she had locked the door, was in time to snatch it from her. She turned like a wild beast, and a terrible oath came hissing as from a feline throat. When, however, she saw not Mary, but the unknown figure of a powerful man, she turned again to the door and fled. Joseph shut and locked it and went back to the closet. Mary drew near the bed. "Where have you been all this time?" asked the patient querulously. "And who's that went out of the room just now? What's all the hurry about?" Anxious he should be neither frightened nor annoyed, Mary replied to the first part of his question only. "I had to go and tell a friend who was waiting for me that I shouldn't be home tonight. But here I am now, and I will not leave you again." "How did the door come to be locked? And who was that went out of the room?" While he was thus questioning, Joseph crept softly out of the window, and all the rest of the night he lay on the top of the wall under it. "It was Miss Yolland," answered Mary. "What business had she in my room?" "She shall not enter it again while I'm here." "Don't let Mewks in either," he rejoined. "I heard the door unlock and lock again. What did it mean?" "Wait till tomorrow. Perhaps we shall find out then." He was silent a little. "I must get out of this house, Mary," he sighed at length. "When the doctor comes, we shall see," said Mary. "What? Is the doctor coming? Ah, I'm glad of that. Who sent for him?" "I don't know. I only heard he was coming." "But your lawyer, Mary, what's his name, will be here first. We'll talk the thing over with him and take his advice. I feel better, and shall go to sleep again." All night long Mary sat by him and watched. Not a step, so far as she knew, came near the door. Certainly not a hand was laid upon the lock. Mr. Redmain slept soundly, and in the morning was beyond a doubt better. But Mary could not think of leaving him until Mr. Brett came. At Mr. Redmain's request, she rang the bell. Mewks made his appearance with the face of a ghost. His master told him to bring his breakfast. "And see, Mewks," he added in a tone of gentleness that terrified the man, so unaccustomed was he to such from the mouth of his master, "see that there is enough for Miss Marston as well. She has had nothing all night. Don't let my lady have any trouble with it. Stop," he cried, as Mewks was going. "I won't have you touch it either. I'm fastidious this morning. Tell the young woman they call Jemima to come here to Miss Marston." Mewks slunk away. Jemima came, and Mr. Redmain ordered her to get breakfast for himself and Mary. It was done speedily, and Mary remained in the sick chamber until the lawyer arrived. End of chapter 54. The next night. Recording by Maria Brook, New Zealand.
Chapter 55 of Mary Marston. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rebecca Case. Mary Marston by George MacDonald. Chapter 55, Disappearance. "I'm afraid I must ask you to leave us now, Miss Marston," said Mr. Brett, seated with pen, ink, and paper to receive his new client's instructions. "No," said Mr. Redmain, "she must stay where she is. I fancy something happened last night which she has got to tell us about." "Ah, what was that?" asked Mr. Brett, facing round on her. Mary began her story with the incident of her having been pursued by someone, and rescued by the blacksmith, whom she told her listeners she had known in London. Then she narrated all that had happened the night before, from first to last, not forgetting the flame that lighted the closet as they approached the window. "Just let me see those memoranda," said Mr. Brett to Mr. Redmain, rising and looking for the paper where he had left it the day before. "It was of that paper I was this moment thinking," answered Mr. Redmain. "It is not here," said Mr. Brett. "I thought as much. The fool! There was £1,000 there for her. I didn't want to drive her to despair. A dying man must mind what he is about. Ring the bell and see what Mewks has to say. Ring the bell and see what Mewks has to say to it. Mewks came, in evident anxiety. I will not record his examination. Mr. Brett took it for granted he had deliberately and intentionally shut out Mary, and Mewks did not attempt to deny it, protesting he believed she was boring his master. The grin on that master's face at hearing this was not very pleasant to behold. When examined as to the missing paper, he swore by all that was holy he knew nothing about it. Mr. Brett next requested the presence of Miss Yolland. She was nowhere to be found. The place was searched throughout, but there was no trace of her. When the doctor arrived, the bottle Joseph had taken from her was examined, and its contents discovered. Lady Malice was grievously hurt at the examination she found had been going on. "Haven't I nursed you like my own brother, Mr. Redmain?" she said. "You may be glad you have escaped a coroner's inquest in this house, Lady Margaret," said Mr. Brett. "For me," said Mr. Redmain, "I have not many days left, but somehow a fellow does like to have his own." Hesper sought Mary, and kissed her with some appearance of gratitude. She saw what a horrible suspicion, perhaps even accusation, she had saved her from. The behavior and disappearance of Sepia seemed to give her little trouble. Mr. Brett got enough out of Mewks to show the necessity of his dismissal, and the doctor sent from London a man fit to take his place. Almost every evening, until he left Durnmelling, Mary went to see Mr. Redmain. She read to him, and tried to teach him, as one might teach an unchildlike child. And something did seem to be getting into, or waking up in, him. The man had never before in the least submitted, but now it looked as if the watching spirits of life were feeling through the dust heap of his evil judgments, low thoughts, and bad life, to find the thing that spirit had made, lying buried somewhere in the frightful tumult. When the two met and joined, then would the man be saved. God and he would be together. Sometimes he would utter the strangest things, such as if all the evil modes of thinking and feeling were in full operation again. And sometimes for days Mary would not have an idea what was going on in him. When suffering, he would occasionally break into fierce and evil language, then be suddenly silent. God and Satan were striving for the man, and victory would be with him with whom the man should side. For some time it remained doubtful whether this attack was not, after all, going to be the last. The doctor himself was doubtful, and, having no reason to think his death would be a great grief in the house, did not hesitate much to express his doubt. And, indeed, it caused no gloom, for there was little love in the attentions the Mortimers paid him. And in what other hope could Hester have married, than that one day she would be free, with a freedom informed with power, the power of money. But to the mother's suggestions as to possible changes in the future, the daughter never responded. She had no thought of plans in common with her. Strange rumors came abroad. Godfrey Wardour heard something of them, and laughed them to scorn. There was a conspiracy in that house to ruin the character of the loveliest woman in creation. But when a week after week passed, and he heard nothing of, or from her, he became anxious, and at last lowered his pride so far as to call on Mary, under the pretense of buying something in the shop. His troubled look filled her with sympathy, but she could not help being glad afresh that he had escaped the snares laid for him. He looked at her searchingly, and at last murmured a request that she would allow him to have a little conversation with her. She led the way to her parlor, closed the door, and asked him to take a seat. But Godfrey was too proud or too agitated to sit. "You will be surprised to see me on such an errand, Miss Marston," he said. "I do not yet know your errand," replied Mary, "but I may not be so much surprised as you think." "Do not imagine," said Godfrey stiffly, "that I believe a word of the contemptible reports in circulation. I come only to ask you to tell me the real nature of the accusations brought against Miss Yolland. Your name is, of course, coupled with them." "Mr. Wardour," said Mary, "if I thought you would believe what I told you, I would willingly do as you ask me. As it is, allow me to refer you to Mr. Brett, the lawyer, whom I dare say you know." Happily, the character of Mr. Brett was well known in Testbridge and all the country round, and from him Godfrey Wardour learned what sent him travelling on the continent again, not in the hope of finding Sepia. What became of her, none of her family ever learned. Some time after, it came out that the same night on which the presence of Joseph rescued Mary from her pursuer, a man speaking with a foreign accent went to one of the surgeons in Testbridge to have his shoulder set, which he said had been dislocated by a fall. When Joseph heard it, he smiled, and thought he knew what it meant. Hesper was no sooner in London than she wrote to Mary, inviting her to go and visit her. But Mary answered she could no more leave home, and must content herself with the hope of seeing Mrs. Redmain when she came to Durnmelling. As long as her husband lived, the time for that did not again arrive. But when Mary went to London, she always called on her, and generally saw Mr. Redmain. But they never had any more talk about the things Mary loved most. That he continued to think of those things, she had one ground of hoping, namely, the kindness with which he invariably received her, and the altogether gentler manner he wore as often and as long as she saw him. Whether the change was caused by something better than physical decay, who knows save him, who can use even decay for redemption? He lived 2 years more, and died rather suddenly. After his death, and that of her father, which followed soon, Hesper went again to Durnmelling, and behaved better to her mother than before. Mary sometimes saw her, and a flicker of genuine friendship began to appear on Hesper's part. Mr. Turnbull was soon driving what he called a roaring trade. He bought and sold a great deal more than Mary, but she had business sufficient to employ her days, and leave her nights free, and bring her and Letty enough to live on as comfortably as they desired, with not a little left over, to use, when occasion was, for others, and something to lay by for the time of lengthening shadows. Turnbull seemed to have taken a lesson from his late narrow escape, for he gave up the worst of his speculations, and confined himself to genuine business principles, the more contentedly that, all Marston folly swept from his path, he was free to his own interpretation of the phrase. He grew a rich man, and died happy, so his friends said, and said as they saw. Mrs. Turnbull left Testbridge, and went to live in a small country town where she was unknown. There she was regarded as the widow of an officer in Her Majesty's service, and, as there was no one within a couple 100 miles to support an assertion to the contrary, she did not think it worth her while to make one. Was not the supposed brevet a truer index of her consciousness of herself than the actual ticket, by ill luck attached to her, widow of a linen draper? George carried on the business, and, when Mary and he happened to pass in the street, they nodded to each other. Letty was diligent in business, but it never got into her heart. She continued to be much liked, and in the shop was delightful. If she ever had another offer of marriage, the fact remained unknown. She lived to be a sweet, gracious little old lady, and often forgot that she was a widow, but never that she was a wife. All the days of her appointed time she waited till her change should come, and she could find her Tom on the other side, looking out for her, as he had said he would. Her mother-in-law could not help dying, but she never forgave her, for what nobody knew. After a year or so, Mrs. Wardour began to take a little notice of her again, but she never asked her to Thornwick until she found herself dying. Perhaps she then remembered a certain petition in the Lord's Prayer. But will it not be rather a dreadful thing for some people if they are forgiven as they forgive? Old Mr. Dupa died, and a young man came to minister to his congregation who thought the baptism of the Spirit of more importance than the most correct of opinions concerning even the baptizing Spirit. From him Mary found she could learn, and would be much to blame if she did not learn. From him Letty also heard what increased her desire to be worth something before she went to rejoin Tom. Joseph Jasper became once more Mary's pupil. She was now no more content with her little cottage piano, but had an instrument of quite another capacity on which to accompany the violin of the blacksmith. To him trade came in steadily, and before long he had to build a larger shoeing shed. From a wide neighborhood horses were brought to him to be shod, cartwheels to be tired, axles to be mended, plowshares to be sharpened, and all sorts of odd jobs to be done. He soon found it necessary to make arrangements with a carpenter and a wheelwright to work on his premises. Before 2 years were over, he was what people call a flourishing man, and laying by a little money. "But," he said to Mary, "I can't go on like this, you know, miss. I don't want money. It must be meant to do something with, and I must find out what that something is." End of chapter 55.
Chapter 56 of Mary Marston. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michael Packard. Mary Marston by George MacDonald. Chapter 56. A Catastrophe. One winter evening, as soon as his work was over for the day, Joseph locked the door of his smithy, washed himself well, put on clean clothes, and, taking his violin, set out for Testbridge. Mary was expecting him to tea. It was the afternoon of a holiday, and she had closed early. Was there ever a happier man than Joseph that night as he strode along the footpath? A day of invigorating and manly toil behind him, folded up in a sense of work accomplished. A clear sky overhead, beginning to breed stars. The pale, amber hope of tomorrow's sunrise low down in the west. A frosty air around him, challenging to the surface of the glow of the forge which his day's labor had stored in his body. His heart and brain at rest with his Father in heaven. His precious violin under his arm. Before him, the welcoming parlor where 2 sweet women waited his coming. One of them, the brightest angel in or out of heaven to him, and the prospect of a long evening of torrent music between them. Who, I repeat, could have been more blessed, heart and soul and body, than Joseph Jasper? His being was like an all-sided lens, concentrating all joys in the one heart of his consciousness. God only knows how blessed he could make us, if we would but let him. He pressed his violin case to his heart, as if it were a living thing that could know that he loved it. Before he reached the town, the stars were out, and the last of the sunset had faded away. Earth was gone, and heaven was all. Joseph was now a reader, and read geology and astronomy. "I've got to do with them all," he said to himself, looking up. "There lies the fields of my future, when this chain of gravity is unbound from my feet. Blessed am I here now, my God, and blessed shall I be there then." When he reached the suburbs, the light of homes was shining through curtains of all colors. "Every nest has its own birds," said Joseph. "Every heart its own joys." Just then, he was in no mood to think of the sorrows. But the sorrows are sickly things and die. But the joys are strong divine children and shall live forevermore. When he climbed the streets, all the shops he passed were closed, except the beer shops and the chemists. "The nettle in the dock," said Joseph. When he reached Mary's shop, he turned into the court to the kitchen door. "Through the kitchen to the parlor," he said. "Through the smithy to the presence chamber, O my God, through the mud of me up to thy righteousness." He was in a mood for music, was he not? One might imagine that the violin under his arm was possessed by an angel, and, ignoring his ears, was playing straight into his heart. Beanie let him in, and took him to the parlor. Mary came halfway to meet him. The pressure as of heaven's atmosphere fell around him, calming and elevating. He stepped across the floor, still, stately, and free. He laid down his violin and seated himself where Mary told him, in her father's armchair by the fire. Gentle nothings with a down of rainbows were talked until tea was over. And then, without a word, they set to their music, Mary and Joseph, with their own hearts, and Letty to their audience. They had not gone far on the way to Fairyland, however, when Beanie called Letty from the room to speak to a friend and customer, who had come from the country on a sudden necessity for something from the shop. Letty, finding herself not quite equal to the emergency, came in her turn to call Mary. She went as quietly as if she were leaving a tiresome visitor. The music was broken, and Joseph left alone with the dumb instruments. But in his hands, solitude and a violin were sure to marry in music. He began to play, forgot himself utterly, and when the customer had gone away satisfied, and the ladies returned to the parlor, there he stood with his eyes closed, playing on, not knowing they were beside him. They sat down and listened in silence. Mary had not listened long before she found herself strangely moved. Her heart seemed to swell up into her throat, and it was all she could do to keep from weeping. A little longer, and she was compelled to yield, and the silent tears flowed freely. Letty, too, was overcome, more than ever she had been by music. She was not so open to its influences as Mary, but her eyes were full, and she sat thinking of her Tom, far in the regions that are none the less true that we cannot see them. A mood had taken shape in the mind of the blacksmith, and wandered from its home, seeking another country. It is not the ghosts of evil deeds that alone take shape and go forth to wander the earth. Let but a mood be strong enough, and the soul, clothing itself in that mood as with a garment, can walk abroad and haunt the world. Thus, in a garment of mood, whose color and texture was music, did the soul of Joseph Jasper that evening, like a homeless ghost, come knocking at the door of Mary Marston. It was the very being of the man, praying for admittance, even as little Abel might have crept up to the gate from which his mother had been driven, and seeing nothing of the angel with the flaming sword, knocked and knocked, entreating to be let in, pleading that all was not right in the world in which he found himself. And there Mary saw Joseph stand, thinking himself alone with his violin, and the violin was his mediator with her, and was pleading and pleading for the admittance of its master. It prayed, it wept, it implored, it cried aloud that eternity was very long, and like a great palace, without a quiet room. Gorgeous is the glory, it sang. White are the garments, and lovely are the faces of the holy. They look upon me gently and sweetly, but pitifully, for they know that I am alone. Yet not alone, for I love. Oh, rather 1,000-fold let me love and be alone, than be content and joyous with them all, free from this pang which tells me of a bliss yet more complete, fulfilling the gladness of heaven. All the time Joseph knew nothing of where his soul was, for he thought Mary was in the shop and beyond the hearing of his pleader. Nor was this exactly the shape the thing took to the consciousness of the musician. He seemed to himself to be standing alone in a starry and moonlit night among roses and sweet peas and apple blossoms. For the soul cares little for the seasons, and it will make its own month out of many. On the bough of an apple tree, in the fair moonlight, sat a nightingale, swaying to and fro like one mad with the wine of his own music, singing as if he wanted to break his heart and have done, for the delight was too much for mortal creature to endure. And the song of the bird grew the prayer of a man in the brain and heart of the musician, and thence burst through the open fountain of the violin, and worked what it could work in the world of forces. "I love thee, I love thee, I love thee," cried the violin, and the worship was entreaty that knew not itself. On and on it went, ever beginning ere it ended, as if it could never come to a close, and the two sat listening, as if they cared but to hear, and would hear forever, listening as if, when the sound ceased, all would be at an end, and chaos come again. Ah, do not blame, thou who lovest God, and fearest the love of the human. Hast thou yet to learn that the love of the human is love, is divine, is but a lower form of the part of the love of God? When thou lovest man, or woman, or child, yea, or even dog, aright, then wilt thou no longer need that I tell thee how God and his Christ would not be content with each other alone in the glories even of the eternal original love, because they could create more love. For that more love, together they suffered, and patiently waited. He that loveth not his brother, whom he hath seen, how shall he love God whom he hath not seen? A sob, like a bird new born, burst from Mary's bosom. It broke the enchantment in which Joseph was bound. That enchantment had possessed him, usurping as it were the throne of his life and displacing it. When it ceased, he was not his own master. He started, to conscious confusion only, neither knowing where he was nor what he did. His limbs for a moment were hardly his own. How it happened he never could tell, but he brought down his violin with a crash against the piano, then somehow stumbled and all but fell. In the act of recovering himself, he heard the neck of his instrument part from the body with a tearing, discordant cry, like the sound of the ruin of a living world. He stood up, understanding now, holding in his hand his dead music, and regarding it with a smile sad as the winter sunset gleaming over a grave. But Mary darted to him, threw her arms around him, laid her head on his bosom, and burst into tears. Tenderly he laid his broken violin on the piano, and, like one receiving a gift straight from the hand of the Godhead, folded his arms around the woman. Enough if music itself had been blotted from the universe. His violin was broken, but his being was made whole. His treasure taken, type of his self, and a woman given him instead. "It's just like him," he murmured. He was thinking of him who, when a man was brought him to be delivered from a poor palsy, forgave him his sins. End of chapter 56. A Catastrophe. Recording by Michael Packard.
Chapter 57 of Mary Marston. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mary Marston by George MacDonald. Chapter 57. The End of the Beginning. Joseph Jasper and Mary Marston were married the next summer. Mary did not leave her shop, nor did Joseph leave his forge. Mary was proud of her husband, not merely because he was a musician, but because he was a blacksmith. For, with the true taste of a right woman, she honoured the manhood that could do hard work. The day will come, and I may do something to help it hither, when the youth of our country will recognise that, taken in itself, it is more manly, and therefore in the old true sense of a more gentle thing, to follow a good handicraft, if it makes the hands black as coal, than to spend the day in keeping books and making up accounts, though therein the hands should remain white, or red, as the case may be. Not but that, from a higher point of view still, all work set by God and done divinely is of equal honour. But where there is a choice, I would gladly see boy of mine choose rather to be a blacksmith, or a watchmaker, or a bookbinder, than a clerk. Production, making, is a higher thing in the scale of reality than any mere transmission, such as buying and selling. It is, besides, easier to do honest work than to buy and sell honestly. The more honour, of course, to those who are honest under the greater difficulty. But the man who knows how needful the prayer, "Lead us not into temptation," knows that he must not be tempted into temptation even by the glory of duty under difficulty. In humility we must choose the easiest, as we must hold our faces unflinchingly to the hardest, even to the seeming impossible, when it is given us to do. I must show the blacksmith and the shopkeeper once more, 2 years after marriage, time long enough to have made common people as common to each other as the weed by the roadside. But these are not common to each other yet, and never will be. They will never complain of being désillusions, for they have never been illuded. They look up each to the other still, because they were right in looking up each to the other from the first. Each was, and therefore each is and will be real. The man is honest, therefore he will be. Timon. It was a lovely morning in summer. The sun was but a little way above the horizon, and the dewdrops seemed to have come scattering from him as he shook his locks when he rose. The foolish larks were up, of course, for they fancied, come what might of winter and rough weather, the universe founded in eternal joy, and themselves endowed with the best of all rights to be glad, for there was the gladness inside, and struggling to get outside of them. And out of it was coming in divine profusion. How many baskets would not have been wanted to gather up the lordly waste of those scattered songs? In all the trees, in all the flowers, in every grass blade and every weed, the sun was warming and coaxing and soothing life into higher life. And in those two on the path through the fields from Testbridge, the same sun, light from the Father of lights, was nourishing highest life of all, that for the sake of which the Lord came, that he might set it growing in hearts of whose existence it was the very root. Joseph and Mary were taking their walk together before the day's work should begin. Those who have a good conscience and are not at odds with their work can take their pleasure any time, as well before their work as after it. Only where the work of the day is a burden grievous to be borne is there cause to fear being unfitted for duty by the antecedent pleasure. But the joy of the sunrise would linger about Mary all day long in the gloomy shop, and for Joseph, he had but to lift his head to see the sun hastening on to the softer and yet more hopeful splendours of the evening. The wife, who had not to begin so early, was walking with her husband, as was her custom, even when the weather was not of the best, to see him fairly started on his day's work. It was with something very like pride, yet surely nothing evil, that she would watch the quick blows of his brawny arm as he beat the cold iron on the anvil till it was all aglow like the sun that lighted the world, then stuck it into the middle of his coals, and blew softly with his bellows till the flame on the altar of his work-offering was awake and keen. The sun might shine or forbear, the wind might blow or be still, the path might be crisp with frost or soft with mire, but the lighting of her husband's forge fire, Mary, without some forceful reason, never omitted to turn by her presence into a holy ceremony. It was to her the "Come, let us worship and bow down" of the daily service of God-given labour. That done, she would kiss him and leave him. She had her own work to do. Filled with prayer, she would walk steadily back the well-known way to the shop, where all day long, ministering with gracious service to the wants of her people, she would know the evening and its service drawing nearer and nearer, when Joseph would come, and the delights of heaven would begin afresh at home, in music and verse and trustful talk. Every day was a life, and every evening a blessed death, type of that larger evening rounding our day with larger hope. But many Christians are such awful pagans that they will hardly believe it possible a young loving pair should think of that evening except with misery and by rare compulsion. That morning as they went they talked, thus or something like it. "Oh, Mary," said Joseph, "hear the larks. They're all saying, 'Joseph, Joseph, hearken to me, Joseph. What would you have been but for Mary, Joseph?' That's what they keep on singing in the ears of my heart, Mary. You would have been a true man, Joseph, whatever the larks may say. A solitary melody, praising without an upholding harmony at best, Mary. And what should I have been, Joseph? An inarticulate harmony, sweetly mumbling with never a thread of soaring song?" A pause followed. "I should be rather shy of your father, Mary," said Joseph. "Perhaps he won't be content with me." "Even if you weren't what you are, my father would love you because I love you. But I know my father as well as I know you, and I know you are just the man it must make him happy afresh even in heaven to think of his Mary marrying. You two can hardly be of two minds in anything." "That was a curious speech of Letty's yesterday. You heard her say, did you not, that if everybody was to be so very good in heaven, she was afraid it would be rather dull?" "We mustn't make too much of what Letty says, either when she's merry or when she's miserable. She speaks both times only out of half-way down." Yes, I wasn't meaning to find any fault with her. I was only wishing to hear what you would say. For nobody can make a story without somebody wicked enough to set things wrong in it, and then all the work lies in settling them right again. And as soon as they are set right, then the story stops. "There's no thing of the sort in music, Joseph, and that makes one happy enough."
"Yes, there is, Mary. There's strife, and difference, and compensation, and atonement, and reconciliation."
"But there's nothing wicked."
"No, that there is not."
"Well," said Mary, "perhaps it may only be because we know so little about good that it seems to us not enough. We know only the beginnings and the fightings, and so write and talk only about them. For my part, I don't feel that strife of any sort is necessary to make me enjoy life. Of all things it is what makes me miserable. I grant you that effort and struggle add immeasurably to the enjoyment of life, but those I look upon as labour, not strife. There may be whole worlds for us to help bring into order and obedience, and I suspect there must be no end of work in which is strife enough, and that of a kind hard to bear. There must be millions of spirits in prison that want preaching to, and whoever goes among them will have that which is behind of the inflictions of Christ to fill up. Anyhow, there will be plenty to do, and that's the main thing. Seeing we are made in the image of God, and He is always working, we could not be happy without work."
"Do you think we shall get into any company we like up there?" said Joseph. "I must think a minute. When I want to understand, I find myself listening for what my father would say. Yes, I think I know what he would say to that." "Yes, but not till you are fit for it, and then the difficulty would be to keep out of it. For all that is fit must come to pass in the land of fitnesses, that is, the land where all is just as it ought to be."
That's how I could fancy I heard my father answer you.
"With that answer I'm well content," said Joseph. "But you don't want to die, do you, Mary?"
"No, I want to live, and I've got such a blessed plenty of life while waiting for more, that I'm quite content to wait. But I do wonder that some people I know should cling to what they call life as they do. It's not that they're comfortable, for they are constantly complaining of their sufferings, neither is it from submission to the will of God, for to hear them talk you must think they imagine themselves hardly dealt with. They profess to believe the gospel, and that is their only consolation, and yet they speak of death as the one paramount evil, in the utmost weariness, They yet seem incapable of understanding the apostle's desire to depart and be with Christ, or of imagining that to be with him can be at all so good as remaining where they are. One is driven to ask whether they can be Christians any further than anxiety to secure whatever the profession may be worth to them will make them such. "Don't you think, though," said Joseph, "that some people have a trick of putting on their clothes wrong side out, and so making themselves appear less respectable than they are? There was my sister Anne. She used to go on scolding at people for not believing. All the time she said they could not believe till God made them. If she had said except God made them, I should have been with her there. And then talking about God so, that I don't see how, even if they could, anyone would have believed in such a monster as she made of him. And then, if you objected to believe in such a God, she would tell you it was all from the depravity of your own heart. You could not believe in him, and yet this sister Anne of mine, I know, once went for months without enough to eat, without more than just keep body and soul together, that she might feed children of a neighbour, of whom she knew next to nothing, when their father lay ill of a fever and could not provide for them. And she didn't look for any thanks neither, except it was from that same God she would have to be a tyrant from the beginning, one who could calmly behold the unspeakable misery of creatures whom he had compelled to exist, whom he would not permit to cease, and for whom he would do a good deal, but not all that he could. Such people, I think, are nearly as unfair to themselves as they are to God." "You're right, Joseph," said Mary. "If we won't take the testimony of such against God, neither must we take it against themselves. Only why is it that they are always so certain they are in the right?" "For the perfecting of the saints," suggested Joseph, with a curious smile. "Perhaps," answered Mary. "Anyhow, we may get that good out of them whether they be here for the purpose or not. I remember Mr. Turnbull once accusing my father of irreverence, because he spoke about God in the shop. Said my father, 'Our Lord called the old temple his father's house and a den of thieves,' in the same breath. Mr. Turnbull saw nothing but nonsense in the answer. Said my father then, 'You will allow that God is everywhere?' 'Of course,' replied Mr. Turnbull. 'Except in this shop, I suppose you mean,' said my father. 'No, I don't. That's just why I wouldn't have you do it.' 'Then you wouldn't have me think about him either.' 'Well, there's a time for everything.' 'Then,' said my father very solemnly, 'I came from God, and I'm going back to God, and I won't have any gaps of death in the middle of my life.' And that was nothing to Mr. Turnbull either. To 1 in 10 of my readers, it may be something. Just ere they came in sight of the smithy, they saw a lady and a gentleman on horseback flying across the common. "There go Mrs. Redmayne and Mr. Wardour," said Joseph. "They're to be married next month, they say. Well, it's a handsome couple they'll make, and the 2 properties together'll make a fine estate." "I hope she'll learn to like the books he does," said Mary. "I never could get her to listen to anything for more than 3 minutes." Though Joseph generally dropped work long before Mary shut the shop, she yet not unfrequently contrived to meet him on his way home, and Joseph always kept looking out for her as he walked. That very evening they were gradually nearing each other, the one from the smithy, the other from the shop, with another pair between them, however, going towards Testbridge, Godfrey Wardour and Hesper Redmayne. "How strange," said Hesper, "that, after all its chances and breakings, old Thornwick should be joined up again at last." Partly by a death in the family, partly through the securities her husband had taken on the property, partly by the will of her father, the whole of Durnmelling now belonged to Hesper. "It is strange," answered Godfrey with an involuntary sigh. Hesper turned and looked at him. It was not merely sadness she saw in his face. There was something there almost like humility, though Hesper was not able to read it as such. He lifted his head and did not avoid her gaze. "You are wondering, Hesper," he said, "that I do not respond with more pleasure. To tell you the truth, I have come through so much that I am almost afraid to expect the fruition of any good.
Please do not imagine, you beautiful creature, it is of the property I am thinking. In your presence that would be impossible. Nor, indeed, have I begun to think of it. I shall one day come to care for it, I do not doubt. That is, when once I have you safe. But I keep looking for the next slip that is to come between my lip and this full cup of happiness. I have told you all, Hesper, and I thank you you do not despise me. But it may well make me solemn and fearful to think, after all the waves and billows that have gone over me, such a splendour should be mine. But do you really love me, Hesper, or am I walking in my sleep? I had thought, surely now at last I shall never love again, and instead of that here I am loving as I have never loved before, and doubting whether I ever did love before. I never loved before, said Hesper. Surely to love must be a good thing, when it has made you so good. I am a poor creature beside you, Godfrey, but I am glad to think whatever I know of love you have taught me. It is only I who have to be ashamed. That is all your goodness, interrupted Godfrey. Yet at this moment I cannot quite be sorry for some things I ought to be sorry for. But for them I should not be at your side now, happier than I dare allow myself to feel. I dare hardly think of those things, lest I should be glad I had done wrong. There are things I am compelled to know of myself, Godfrey, which I shall never speak to you about, for even to think of them by your side would blast all my joy. How plainly Mary used to tell me what I was. I scorned her words. It seemed then too late to repent. And now I am repenting. I little thought ever to give in like this, but of one thing I am sure, that if I had known you, not all the terrors of my father would have made me marry the man. Was this all the feeling she had for her dead husband? Although Godfrey could hardly at the moment feel regret she had not loved him, it yet made him shiver to hear her speak of him thus. In the perfected grandeur of her external womanhood, she seemed to him the very ideal of his imagination, and he felt at moments the proudest man in the great world. But at night he would lie in torture, brooding over the horrors a woman such as she must have encountered, to whom those mysteries of our nature, which the true heart clothes in abundant honour, had been first presented in the distortions of a devilish caricature. There had been a time in Godfrey's life when, had she stood before him in all her splendour, he would have turned from her, because of her history, with a sad disgust. Was he less pure now? He was more pure, for he was humbler. When those terrible thoughts would come, and the darkness about him grow billowy with black flame, "God help me," he would cry, "to make the buffeted angel forget the past." They had talked of Mary more than once, and Godfrey, in part through what Hesper had told him of her, had come to see that he was unjust to her. I do not mean he had come to know the depth and extent of his injustice. That would imply a full understanding of Mary herself, which was yet far beyond him. 1,000 things had to grow, 1,000 things to shift and shake themselves together in Godfrey's mind, before he could begin to understand one who cared only for the highest. Godfrey and Hesper made a glorious pair to look at, but would theirs be a happy union? Happy, I dare say, and not too happy. He who sees to our affairs will see that the two is not in them. There were fine elements in both, and if indeed they loved, and now, I think, from very necessity of their two hearts, they must have loved, then all would, by degrees, by slow degrees, most likely come right with them. If they had been born again both before they began, so to start fresh, then, like two children, hand in hand, they might have run through the gates into the city. But what is love? What is loss? What defilement even? What are pains and hopes and disappointments? What sorrow and death and all the ills that flesh is heir to, but means to this very end, to this waking of the soul to seek the home of our being, the life eternal? Verily, we must be born from above and be good children, or become, even to our self-loving selves, a scorn, a hissing,
and an endless reproach. If they had had but Mary to talk to them! But they did not want her. She was a good sort of creature who, with all her disagreeableness, meant them well, and whom they had misjudged a little and made cry. They had no suspicion that she was one of the lights of the world, one of the wells of truth, whose springs are fed by the rains on the eternal hills. Turning a clump of furze bushes on the common, they met Mary. She stepped from the path. Mr. Wardour took off his hat. Then Mary knew his wrath was past, and she was glad. They stopped. "Well, Mary," said Hesper, holding out a hand and speaking in a tone from which both haughtiness and condescension had vanished. "Where are you going?" "To meet my husband," answered Mary. "I see him coming." With a deep, loving look at Hesper, and a bow and a smile to Godfrey, she left them, and hastened to meet her working man. Behind Godfrey Wardour and Hesper Redmayne walked Joseph Jasper and Mary Marston, a procession of love towards a far-off eternal goal. But which of them was to be first in the kingdom of heaven, Mary or Joseph, or Hesper or Godfrey, is not to be told. They had yet a long way to walk, and there are first that shall be last, and last that shall be first. End of chapter 57. The End of the Beginning. End of Mary Marston by George MacDonald. Recording by Maria Brook.